Special Operations, Covert Ops, Espionage, The Team House, with your hosts, Jack Murphy and David Park.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 265 of The Team House. I'm Jack, here with Dave, and our guest on tonight's show is Dale Bendler. He served as a CIA paramilitary officer and then went on to a number of foreign intelligence assignments, served as chief of station in a couple locations. Really interesting career, Central America, Africa, West Europe. Dale, we're excited to have you here. This has been a long time coming, I feel like.
It's my pleasure.
Thanks
Jack,
for coming
Dave,
out.
My pleasure.
So, man, tell us a little bit about, your origin story. I'm hearing that echo, D. Could you mute that, please? Tell us a little bit about like how you came up, how you grew up, and what sort of like propelled you towards military service initially.
Well, it's a middle class, New Jersey. In fact, in the Marine Corps, my nickname was Turnpike, but exit 4, so closer to Philadelphia than New York. So hence the South Jersey accent, Philadelphia accent. And we would be Flyers and Sixers and Eagles and Phillies fans. Really no mentor, and I don't know why, even after all these years, with the chance to reflect, why I had to scratch that itch and join the service, and within the service, why the Marine Corps.
This was post-Vietnam.
This was post-Vietnam,
Not
1975.
Not really a popular time to join the military. But you felt it.
That's correct. 1975 to 1979. And I reflect back on those years, and there's probably a kernel of truth to the argument there was a hollow force, that the 82nd existed on paper, the 2nd Marine Division existed on paper, but they may not have been as effective forces as we wanted them to be. Racial tensions on all sides, drug abuse, not much budget, no mission, and still an anti-Vietnam sentiment. I cheated to a degree. I escaped to elite units. So the man to my left or right were highly motivated, as I was at the time.
So you went to boot camp as a 0311 infantryman. I mean, how did that come about that you ended up like hearing about Recon and realized this could be a possibility for you?
Right, so receiving at Camp Lejeune in the late summer, early fall of 1975, an E5 or E6 came around and asked who could swim. Some people raised their hand, a lot of people didn't. And what a GT score, so that's in the Army you call it?
Yeah, it's a GT. It's from
GT.
the,
was decent apparently, so they said you're going to Recon. And it sounded cool, and I was pleased. So I went to 2nd Recon Battalion out at on Onslow Beach, right there in the Atlantic at Camp Lejeune. I was there probably for 18 months, and I understand there was an even more elite unit, 2nd Force Recon. So I went to selection for 2nd Force and was accepted.
What was that selection for Force Recon in 1975, 76?
So this would have been 77.
77.
They gave me a flak jacket, a Vietnam-era flak jacket, a gas mask, and an M60, and we started running. Avoiding all those little bridges and making sure you went through every creek there was. And then there was a physical fitness test and then a swim test. I think swimming with a folding chair under the length of the pool. And it was, but like a lot of people in Force Recon then, physical fitness was what we did. In fact, probably at the expense of learning patrolling or actions at the objectives, we spent a lot of time doing PT. I think the platoon I was in could almost run to max the run for the Marine Corps, the physical fitness test, 3 miles in 18 minutes. We could almost do it in formation.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah.
And you mentioned to me before earlier that you had also gotten a slot to go to Ranger School, which I mean, I went to Ranger School with a couple of Recon Marines, but you said it was pretty rare back in those days.
I'm going to guess 1 or 2 a year, and there's a lot of pressure on us to do well. I was an E5, and I think 1 because I was a Marine, and 2 because I was enlisted. I went in January and February, and it was cold. And I have to say, I greatly appreciated Ranger School. And I felt that upon graduation, I finally had become a special operator because of the emphasis on small unit tactics and actions at the objective, where maybe in Force Recon, at least when I was there, a lot of PT, a lot of jump, a lot of scuba, maybe not as much small unit operations, with an exception. Was amphibious reconnaissance school at Little Creek was also very good, learning core skills of a reconnaissance Marine amphibious mission.
And so what was it like, being in Force Recon? Now we're getting in mid to late 1970s. I mean, what were you guys training for? Did you have any ideas of like missions you might get or deployments that might come up?
So there was obviously still post-Vietnam, so tremendous hesitancy to deploy as your generation did. But it took a year or 2, but I really fell in love with the mission of reconnaissance, and it may have led to a career in the intelligence community, because it wasn't to engage the enemy in sort of a direct action, but to be eyes and ears of the fleet and report back the information on the enemy movements. So yeah, it wasn't hard going from a reconnaissance mission to, say, a case officer espionage mission.
Right. Different type of
Camis,
reconnaissance.
a Brooks Brothers suit.
Yeah.
So,
When did you start toying with the idea of the agency? Was it before you left the Marine Corps, or was it during college?
I was at 2nd Force Recon at Camp Lejeune, and yes, there is a library. The Marines do have a library at
Full of
and
crayons.
There's more than one book, and there was a book on the Bay of Pigs, and so Bay of Pigs happened in 1961. This book was written in probably 77, and I said, "This is." The book underscored the contribution of the Paramilitary Office at CIA, and I said, I think I can do that, but I knew I would have to have a degree.
A little lower. Sorry. I love you. See what I deal with here? So, let me fix my mic first before I begin asking the question. So you decide to leave the Marine Corps, well, already with this idea in your mind that you're going to apply to the agency.
Yes.
Go to college. It's 1980 at
Correct.
this point. Where'd you go to school? What'd you major in?
So I went to Rutgers, a state school of New Jersey, and I appreciated the way you framed that, Jack, because for me, it wasn't so much as education, but training. That my Marine Corps time was training to become a CIA officer, and my time in college was training to be a CIA officer. Rutgers Political Science, with as many courses on the Soviet Union as I could take. China was not an issue at the time.
And you also got to do a study abroad program?
That's correct. So I went to Mexico City and lived with a Mexican family. And I have to say, a year abroad then, it was probably more rewarding than it might be today for young people thinking of a semester abroad, because of the iPhone and Google Translate and watching American flicks on YouTube, etc. You had a backpack and a dog-eared dictionary in the back if you wanted a cerveza or if you wanted to get home.
Yeah.
So I did bring smoking good Spanish at a 3 level. I never had to take, the CIA never had to train me in Spanish, so I had these special operations skills from an elite unit, and a degree in political science, and 3-level Spanish. It isn't just the language skill, but living abroad and liking it and wanting more. Because CIA is an external agency, of course.
And people always ask, Dave and I on this show, like, there are people who are interested in joining the agency or joining some sort of governmental service, the intelligence community. What was your recruitment process like? What was your application process like?
Okay, so I remember sending in my application. Of course, it was typewriters then, and when I got that letter, I still have it, that said we find you competitive for the first interview. And I only had one suit, and it was a thick wool suit, and it was September in Philadelphia, and I probably got there 2 hours early for that meeting and stood outside sweltering, and I wasn't going to be late. And I remember my interview. I remember the hotel. I thought it went well. I thought he may have sympathized with me a little bit for having been a grunt. So he said, "I think you crawled around on your belly enough. I'm going to give you a shot." So I thought I had a pretty good GPA, and I could write well also, but that's what it was. And then when I got the GS9 acceptance letter, I would have taken the GS5, but GS9 seemed really good. Second lieutenant. Step 5, I got a step 6 for Spanish. And curiously, because I had been to jump school, they gave me another step.
Interesting.
Step 7, GS9, step 7. And it was unusual for me that I was sponsored by Special Activities Division. In other words, that the ground branch wanted me.
Like from the application process, they kind of sucked you up, like, this is a dude we want to have here.
That's correct, and I was very thankful for that, flattered. And there were several important operations going on around the world in Central America and Southern Africa and Afghan 1, that I wasn't sure, in my naivete, I wasn't sure, why did I need FI? Why did I need to spin my wheels in Washington and learn which utensil to use at the farm? There are wars to be fought, and I wanted to go. But I had, me and several of my colleagues, contemporaries, we had the chief of ground branch at the time, a gentleman named Chuck, said, no, you're going. Those wars will be waiting for you, don't worry, and there will be plenty of wars. You're going to be op certified.
This was your initial intake when you go
Correct.
to the farm, and they're like, no, you're going to do the whole thing.
Correct.
Yeah.
The full the career trainee program, which was a tad unusual for a paramilitary officer in the day. Many were contractors or maybe paramilitary officers, but not operational certified, case officer certified. But this particular leader we had said, you're going to go. And many of us, many of whom he said that to, went on to very senior rank, more senior than I. We all should be very, very thankful.
What was the relationship between special activities and the agency at large at that point in time?
Second-class citizens. I lived it.
And I mean, you pointed out earlier too that, had you not gone through the full, study program at the farm, that for you and your contemporaries, your careers would have stalled out relatively quickly at a certain point, right? You would not have gotten promoted past a certain point.
I'm going to say, as I understand it, at the GS-13 level.
Yeah.
As I understand it. And these contemporaries I refer to went well into the SIS ranks.
But even though you were trained as a case officer just like everyone else, they still regarded you as, you're first and foremost a Marine grunt.
From the FI side,
Yeah.
that's how we were many of us were viewed. There's a stereotype, but certainly a persistent stereotype that impacted careers.
Yeah.
We had some MAC SOG, MacSOG, veterans left over, and they were amazing leaders, and we learned much from them. Just, if I may, just going back to those Marine Corps years, 75 to 79, every E6 that we met and every O3 that we met had fought in a nasty counterinsurgency in Vietnam, and many of us really just sucked up everything that they could impart on us, and they were great NCOs and officers. And as it turns out, many of the small unit tactics that were passed down to us went on to be very useful in the Bush wars of the 80s, and even, one could argue, the counterinsurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan, and in the Sahel and other Philippines and other places.
So what was it like after you graduate from the farm, you arrive at SAD? What's that sort of experience like when you, I mean, this was your goal, right? You were excited to be there. I mean, what was it like, and how did you start getting involved in, the El Salvador program?
So I was the happiest person in the world. Yeah, and I couldn't believe I had a chance to serve my country. And remember, the Cold War is on. And get paid while doing it, and have a certain prestige. A Foreign Service officer working for the State Department. I was the first out of the gate of my CT career trainee class to PCS overseas, and that was to Eastern El Salvador, to a forward operating base. But before that, let me say, I think you both might appreciate, Ground Branch sent several of us to Mott Lake for SOT.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And I remember close quarter battle.
Yep.
And there were 45s at the time, handguns, and they really put a lot of emphasis on shooting. And we did hand-to-hand, and we did sentry takeout, and it was really impressive.
So
this was by probably 1980, it was early 85.
So for the people out there who are listening, maybe don't know what SOT or Mott Lake was. In 1977, we had the Blue Light program, the Special Forces Counter-terrorism unit. And when they stood that down, they wanted to retain that capability, even though the CT mission went to Delta at that point. But they wanted to retain some of those skills, and that's why they continued running the SOT program out at Mott Lake up until somewhere in the mid-90s. They ran that. And at the time, I mean, again, it's kind of like SF history at this point. But at the time, that was some of the most dynamic CQB and urban warfare training that was being run anywhere.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it almost sounds as though it followed, because if they're teaching you hand-to-hand and stuff like that, it almost sounds like it's following like the old Camp X paradigm of
a little bit.
Training, giving you these commando tactics. Yeah. Training you, in these turbocharged sort of commando tactics. Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah, they had the fuselages out there. There were like shooting lanes, like jungle lanes and stuff.
Correct.
Shoot houses.
Yeah. Yes, correct. I thought it was excellent, and good on Ground Branch to send us there. And we were given black T-shirts, Nous Défions. And later on, I didn't know what it meant at the time, but I went on to serve in French-speaking countries, and we'll defend this.
Yeah.
Excellent. Good for the Army.
Yeah, it's awesome. Previous guest on the show, Ruben Garcia, ran the SOT program for a while.
Maybe he was there. But
May have been.
It was sentry takeout with a garrote
Yeah.
and a K-bar.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Throat slit. Yeah.
That's awesome. And so then, talk to us about how El Salvador came about for you.
So Mr. Casey was the director. Mr. Reagan was the president. So the Cold War was on. That direct conflict with the Soviets is out of the question. But maybe we can go toe-to-toe with them in a third world competition. And so Southern Africa, Central America, and Afghanistan. So I think you had Mr. Devine sitting here and talked eloquently about the Afghan program. So Central America was important, and frankly, closer to home. and I was assigned to the most remote and most violent part of the country. I'd like to say I did it a tad differently, that most in the paramilitary world then would TDY, and not necessarily with the language and maybe not with case officer skills. And I'm not saying I'm better, I'm just saying I was fortunate to be case officer certified, have 3-level Spanish,
And be a recon Marine.
and then have some special small unit tactic counterinsurgency experience. So it was all on counterinsurgency with our Salvadoran partners, and I totally believed in the mission.
Talk to us about what form that took, and what it was like going down there, getting deployed down there, what the enemy situation was like and the friendly situation, and how you kind of evolved that while you PCS down there.
Well, first I have to give a shout out to your generation, because we, as dangerous as it was, we didn't have to deal with SVES or VBIDs, and you two had to deal with that. I would also say, probably like my Vietnam case officer veterans, my brothers and sisters who went before us in Vietnam, we similarly, when we would have an agent meeting up country, it was just us in a thin-skinned vehicle, and maybe we had the Browning high power, was the CIA issued weapon, and I spoke the language, so I didn't have a linguist, and I was my own targeter, and I was my own analyst, so it's just me with a source. And I look back on it in hindsight, it was dangerous.
A bit much, yeah.
Yeah.
Correct. But I got to work with SEALs, and the 7th Group was there, and that, by the mid-'80s, you have that CIA human support to counterinsurgency with NSW and SOF. And from that, when it grew into what it is today, well, it's Vietnam, and
Right.
we continued the tradition.
So who were the insurgents in El Salvador at that time?
So it would be the FMLN was the umbrella group, quartermastered by the Soviet Union, and then supported by Cuba directly. And then there were several guerrilla factions underneath. One of the larger was called the ERP, Ejército Revolucionario del Pueblo, and led by a comandante named Joaquin Villalobos, and famous in
The Wolf.
famous in anybody who has studied the counterinsurgency in El Salvador. Fast forward 20 years, he had moved on to Oxford, where he was doing a dissertation on peace talks, conflict resolution,
Yeah.
and I went to see him.
Interesting.
And it was a fascinating,
Did you get to talk to him?
fascinating one-on-one, fascinating
Wow.
experience in insurgency and counterinsurgency. And he said some very interesting points. I documented it and shared it, because we were in especially DOD, we're in taking on these counterinsurgency missions in the Middle East.
When you guys met all those years later, was it like just two professionals like talking shop?
Two professionals talking shop.
Yeah.
And I remember he said that you often would have that map with the little red dots of insurgents activity. It's actually where there is no activity, is where we have our clandestine infrastructure.
Right.
And that's where the nurse is siphoning off 1 or 2 penicillin pills per week that goes to the insurgent hospital. The college professor is siphoning off 2 or 3 pages of 8x11 that would go into the propaganda. Remember, this is the mid-'80s. Or the campesina who hangs laundry on Wednesdays if government forces are in the area. He said that's where we made most of our money.
Right. The insurgents aren't going to attack where their bed down site is. So it's like the blank site on the map is kind of where you want to
It's
look.
where you needed to be.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if that made its way through Afghanistan and Iraq. It also underscored to me my experiences in El Salvador and the clandestine infrastructure. It's just how effective and how proud the veterans should be who participated in Phoenix. that really hurt the Viet Cong. Brilliant program.
And so for you down there as a paramilitary officer, what was your partner force that you worked with? What were those guys like?
So Salvadoran infantry, there was an elite unit called PRAL, Patrulla Reconocimiento Alta Distancia, long distance, like a LRP.
Yeah, long distance.
But they were based at a strategic asset, and they were based in San Salvador, the capital. And I wasn't. I didn't work with them, so I worked with the line battalions. I will say when I PCS'd there, my R&R point was San Salvador. I mean, I would try to come back once every 2 weeks, and it was definitely an assignment wearing camouflage and carrying a Browning. No M4, but just a Browning.
Yeah.
High power, right.
And I mean, you mentioned meeting with sources, so I mean, it sounds like you really were like the one guy out there supporting these units sort of on the front lines of this counterinsurgency, helping them with their intel, helping them with their training.
Right. I had the lead for Morazan, La Union, and San Miguel, the most conflictive districts, provinces in El Salvador. And please.
How are you identifying, if you look at sort of the agency today and targeters and, analysts and collection managers and all that, but you're out there on the ground in a very tactical world. How are you identifying sources? How are you finding them, recruiting them for the ones that weren't like handed over to you?
Regularly in the prisons of the Salvadoran police or military. And I spent quite a bit. In fact, I remember distinctly one of the proudest moments for me was Christmas Day, 25 December 1985, interrogating a communist insurgent and trying to uncover that insurgent nurse and campesina with the laundry and the professor, and just how fulfilling that was, that my country could enjoy and the families could enjoy Christmas, because some of us were in these kind of places, and I'm sure you've had those same feelings on Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was an honor, and I remember that I feel like I could be in the cell with that guy today. It was just me and him. Needed language.
Right.
And you keep talking to insurgents like that, you become a very good analyst, and you become a good targeter.
Yeah, to go that deep into the culture for that long.
And it stayed with me for a couple decades later, where I like to think I developed a mature, a sophisticated appreciation for counterinsurgency that would later pay dividends in places like Peru.
And so you pointed out that this was like some of the hottest years of the insurgency in El Salvador. What was the enemy doing at that point, and what were you guys doing to fight back?
So that it was still post-Vietnam, and there was a limit on, I think it was 55 Green Berets, and one workaround that would be, say, sending CIA paramilitary officers or case officers, and that way it was for whole government 55 plus maybe 10 or 20. I should also say I'd like to give a shout out to the officers who served on my left and right in El Salvador. They went on to assume very senior positions at CIA, to include Mr. Jose Rodriguez became the DDO, and he was my branch chief then.
But so, I mean, again, back to El Salvador, like, what was the enemy activities and what were you guys doing to counter that insurgency?
Particularly in La Union, I was in the Gulf of Fonseca, and we wanted to interdict weapons coming in across the Gulf from Nicaragua. And I thought the best way to do that wasn't FLIR or aircraft. Of course, we had no imagery.
Right.
And the other three-letter agency, I never heard of them, and I never got a single product from them.
Right.
But and let me say, I grew up without that, and I never needed it.
Yeah.
And when I got it, I appreciated it, but it was a luxury.
Right.
But I grew up
Yeah.
without the GRS, the analyst, the
Yeah.
targeter, the reports officer, or support from other three-letter agencies. So maritime operations to interdict the flow of weapons into the country. And then I really wanted to try to get a spy inside of the Cuba nexus. And I always suspected that there was my Cuban counterpart was in country, but I don't think he ever was. We've had Cuban defectors since,
Like
and
a
I've talked to
DGI
Cubans.
guy.
A DGI or a Tropas Especiales. And they, in the 70s and 80s in Cuba, they were very
Aggressive.
noble adversaries. Yeah, very, very capable. They did Nicaragua.
Were you ever able to penetrate that nexus?
Not as well as I would have liked to,
Yeah.
frankly.
Yeah.
But were you able to start to counter the smuggling routes?
Yes, we were. And I wish Joaquin Villalobos had been my source. We could have probably ended the insurgency, but it's interesting what you learn from the other side post hostilities.
After the fact.
As I understand that, what comes out of Hanoi, the VC and NVA's take on some of our battles are absolutely fascinating for our veterans.
So what did you take away from, like what you learned in hindsight about the conflict you were in?
The clan, particularly the key role of intelligence, human support to the counterinsurgency, and the clandestine infrastructure. And I would have liked to think that may have been more of a focus in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. That the person without the AK or RPG, S-vest, I imagine looking at Hamas and what happened on 7 October, you didn't really have to have a Hamas killer to be your source. You could have had someone selling figs in a market in Gaza saying,
Yeah.
Right.
you know, my cousin borrowed my motorcycle and he won't tell me why.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, something,
Innocuous.
yeah,
Maybe.
seemingly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seemingly.
Were there any things that came up during your discussion, anything that he said that when you think about it in retrospect seems obvious and you can't see how the U.S. missed it? Like obviously things, hindsight is 20/20, but were there things that like seemed like when he said it, you're like, yeah, that seems obvious.
Well,
But we didn't think about it back then.
well, as I mentioned, the lack of insurgent activity is where you're going to have now. They won't conduct offensive operations in those areas either. I
Right.
mean, we're safe.
Right.
Why would you
we
try
could
heat
go to
there?
the beach, or we can
Right.
have a beer out in a Pilsner out in Cerveza out in town. They're not going to stir the pot, right? So that is, and particularly that's CIA's job. I don't really think that
Piece that
our
together.
lesser degree, maybe human certified SOF, NCO, officer NCO, maybe a little bit, but that's really a CIA case officer's role in the counterinsurgency, is that clandestine infrastructure and having a source inside there. Because you don't have to recruit somebody with a weapon.
Right.
And by definition, we can't really get to that insurgent with an AK-47. We could get to that campesina who hangs her laundry out. We can get to that professor, and we can get to the
The
other
nurse.
example I use.
The nurse.
We can,
Yeah.
and we did.
And
Does it make sense? Is
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
so as you get to the end of your time in El Salvador, how had the situation changed? Was the insurgency starting to wind down? Like, what was your perception of how things were going?
And counterinsurgency is if at the end of the year you take cumulatively, not in sequence, 20 steps forward and only 19 back, so it accounts for 1 step forward. That's a good year.
Right.
For your generation, 20 years in Iraq, 20 years in Afghanistan. Imagine if we had taken 1 step forward each year.
Right. Yeah.
So that's Americans are uncomfortable with that, but it's gray. Maybe Colombia's fight against the FARC, it may have been 1 step forward a few those years, right? And it takes
for 50 years.
It takes 50 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
1948. Yeah, Bogota. So yeah.
So, but your feelings were that, there were baby steps in the right direction.
Correct.
On this thing.
Correct.
And how did it actually wind down? Was that before, after, or was it after you left that it kind of sputtered out?
So with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and what that meant for Cuba,
Right.
and what that meant for and the bad name that international communism suffered. So it did. It just withered.
By 89, it was probably pretty much.
I think 91.
91?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, in Nicaragua, it makes sense. It wasn't until 90 that the elections were held. So,
Correct.
Yeah.
So all this was sort of coming, and the Cubans were leaving Angola, and it was all sort of coming to a conclusion.
And then before we move on to the next thing, and I have in my notes, I'm trying to remember exactly what it was that we wanted to talk about. You had some thoughts about foreign intelligence versus paramilitary, because you've done both. Did you want to comment on anything on that, or
maybe talk a little bit about Africa, and then
before we get on to that,
I went into my rotation
into the
also.
FI.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 1987, you're back at headquarters. You hear about the Angola task force. What's going on?
So, 1986, excuse me, in the fall of 86, I had been out of El Salvador maybe a month, and I understood there was a program in Southern Africa, and I walked into that office without telling my chain of command. I said, I'm your man, I'm going.
How'd they respond?
And who are you? And but it was really important that I had counterinsurgency field experience, that I was case officer certified, and what I do have conditions. I want to go PCS, not TDY, and I want to have the language, which wasn't a terrible stretch, transitioning from Spanish to Portuguese. Takes about 3 months, and there's about 300 words that are different.
And for viewers and listeners who aren't familiar with the terms, PCS is a permanent change of station, and then TDY is temporary duty. So there's a different, temporary duty just sends you over whatever the trip is, 3 months, 6 months,
right?
And you come back and you get on rotations. And then a PCS is they move you there, and it's
you're assigned
like
there
a 2 year,
for a number of years,
like a 2 or 3 year bill, whatever it is. But it's so you wanted to be there sort of permanently.
Correct.
To
spot, assess, develop, and recruit. You can't do that TDY. I understand officers go to TDY and work very hard, and I understand they've had successes. I'm saying, in general, it takes more than a few weeks.
Right.
So the same sort of question as I asked about El Salvador. I mean, what's going on in Angola at the time? We were with UNITA, and then it was MPLA on the other side.
Correct.
And FENLA for a little bit. They sputtered out.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And so the Cold War was on, and we didn't know, no one knew how the Cold War was going to end. And the Cubans had massive forces in country, and give credit, once again, I think, to Mr. Reagan. This is a chance for us to go against the Soviets via proxy, to retard Soviet expansionism in the developing world. I think, and this one was where El Salvador was counterinsurgency, this was insurgency. And I can tell you one's a hell of a lot more fun than the other. That in a remote, not very dangerous, but we didn't know that at the time. I also want to give a shout out to my brothers and sisters who served in that area, and I'll just say their first names, Phil and Greg, Scott, They're my friends to this day, and they did amazing work there.
Oh, yeah.
And they went on to assume the highest levels of leadership at CIA. So it's a real honor for me to be associated with people who did that.
Yeah, and those I spoke to two of the three for a piece that I've been working on about Willie Merkerson. We'll get it. I mean, another time we'll tell his entire story about his life and service in Vietnam and then in the CIA. But
Willie's humility is breathtaking.
yeah,
I didn't know he was a DCM.
Distinguished Service Cross.
Yeah, DSC.
Yeah,
DSC.
yeah.
I didn't know he was, and he never told me.
Yeah, he is like that. He's just like, well, it was another day. You know, kind of. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Imagine.
Yeah, yeah. But we'll tell this story another time. But he earned it. He was in combat. Okay, so you're in Angola. This time the partner force is UNITA. You're up against the MPLA, and there's like 50,000 Cuban troops that are over there as well. Soviet Union has their hands in it. What's going on the ground? You said in this case you're sort of you're playing the role more of the insurgent.
So I did get to not work directly with, but observe the SADF, South African Defense Force, and they were very effective. And there was one, again, Soviet quartermastered and Cuban led, that if you lost a Sukhoi or a MiG or a T-55 or a howitzer or the 122s, Katyushas. The Soviet Union would fly in replacements. So, and South Africa, there was an arms embargo, so it was a lot. They were a lot. The losses weren't easily replaced. It had been the biggest tank battle in southeast Angola, the biggest tank battle since World War II. Wow. Now replaced by Ukraine. But it was a war worth studying, and we introduced sensitive surface-to-air missile capability.
Yeah.
It was a tactical weapon at having a strategic impact.
I've been told that we introduced that into Angola actually before Afghanistan.
Imagine.
Yeah, because nobody talks about it or knows about it really.
Imagine.
Yeah. But how did that start to change the situation over there? Was it because it restricted the way the Cubans were able to fly and the close air support they may have been providing?
Indeed, a MiG-23 was shot down, and the Cuban lieutenant colonel and captain were brought into the UNITA base camp. And I asked permission because I'm a Spanish speaker and I have some expertise on Cuba, that I asked permission if I could participate in the interrogation, and it was denied because they were under duress. They were prisoner of war. They were uniformed and they were prisoners of war. And indeed,
oh, I see.
And indeed, we did ask Savimbi to respect their
laws,
human rights.
Yeah,
and they might be more valuable from a human perspective, propaganda perspective, and then a value in a prisoner exchange, and that is what happened.
That's incredible.
That's incredible. And I understand, some months ago I did an interview for Spanish-speaking television, not Spanish television, Spanish-speaking television for the Cuban American community in Miami, and I talked about this case, and I think the pilot wrote into the TV station, was maybe disputing some aspects of my story, but he's alive, so
that's awesome.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So what other activities were you participating in Angola, or I mean, going from like Zaire and projecting into Angola? I mean, what was the mission like at that time?
So we're very small. Where I mentioned El Salvador would have been 55 SF and the defense attaches throughout the embassy, but 55 SF up country. Probably 20 of us, case officers, paramilitary officers, where that Southern African assignment was 2, maybe 3. Period.
Wow.
So, and it was no direct action, but largely, no joint patrolling, but largely let's intel and lethal support to the insurgents.
Yeah, it's that sort of OSS mission that people think it's like dagger in their teeth, but a lot of times it's more you're acting as a coordinator and a logistician, right?
Yes, we were, and it's some want to say it's more than that, but it was heavy on the logistics and the intel. But we all certainly believed in the mission. It was very important.
The South Africans were assisting with that effort.
They were fighting and dying. Yes,
I
in
know
large numbers.
their whole border war, but I mean, with your program, was there any sort of?
There was the understanding that we wouldn't recognize each other
Oh,
because
really?
of the political sensitivities. Because
Right.
apartheid was in full.
That's really interesting because now I remember the interview we did with Kuz, who's a South African recce during the war.
They were very good.
Yeah, they were very good, and I remember him saying, he's like, yeah, we knew the agency guys were over there, but our direction was like, don't even look at them, don't talk to them.
I will just say that we had well, I'm going to say his name. It's J.J. Walker, was a legend in the Special Forces community, one of those Green Berets who went to Vietnam in the mid-'60s and stayed because his dad went away to World War II and only came home when the war was over. So he's going to Vietnam, and he's going to come home when the war's over, and it was an unfair burden of a 5 or 6 or 7 year tour.
Yeah.
And he was passing kidney stones, and we didn't know what to do in the middle of the Kalahari Desert. We certainly didn't have our own aircraft, and the South Africans saved his life. Or I'd better be careful with that.
They came in and got him.
They came in and got him.
Yeah.
And he was hard as nails, like many of those Vietnam era special forces NCOs, hard as nails, and the pain dropped them.
Yeah.
In fact, I looked at one of the stones under a microscope, and it looked like a snowflake.
Just
Shard
all
of
pointy,
glass.
and-
Shard of
yeah.
glass.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
There's a story that I'm recalling, Dale, and maybe it was your story. It may have been another person I talked to. Something about landing on an airfield and like the South Africans show up and the agency guys had to jump into the bushes because they weren't supposed to talk to them.
It's I that's not me, but
Okay,
I can see I believe it.
It's another
And-
friend of mine. I
Yeah,
think.
but I believe it, and but it wasn't
Hostile. It was
Yeah,
just you're not
it's-
supposed to have contact.
right. And I think the condition was, well, as I understand the strategy and how the administration, Mr. Reagan, sold it to Congress was, look, we're weaning UNITA away from the apartheid regime. Let us do this. I think I would just say, looking back in hindsight, of a lesson learned, and I think kudos to your program because you often ask that of your guests so that this maybe a future generation doesn't have to reinvent hard lessons learned, and we
Right.
learned those, correct? And that is, and maybe we could have juxtaposed it on Afghanistan and Iraq, and that is when we looked at Angola, we looked at East-West communism and anti-communism when it was Ubuntu, Chokwe, Lingala, other tribes, Kimbundu, and we looked at it as a Cold War conflict,
Right,
and ignorant of the tribal divisions
Right.
that are, imagine Afghanistan, Ukraine, that I did my best to pass that on to next generations.
Yeah.
Please take under considerations. Take that under consideration. I would say, based on that experience, that you wouldn't hear me refer to a South African as a South African. I want to know if they're black or white, and if black, which tribe, or colored with OU, their word, their spelling, or if they're white, are they English or Afrikaans?
Yeah. exactly.
And
Or
if
German.
you're, or if there is Lebanese, don't say Lebanese because we need to know Christian, Sunni, and
Right.
imagine Iraqis. So we need to be a good case officer needs to be sophisticated in that regard.
Right.
The French intelligence officer stationed in Washington D.C. better know the difference between Northwest Washington and Southeast.
Right.
Not disparaging one or the other, but there's two different worlds, correct?
Yeah.
And the French know West Africa pretty well also.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but it's interesting because with the United States, and I don't want to say the intel agencies because I think it's just a thing across the board in the United States. So our politicians, our public, everything like we don't understand the intricacies of other countries well, and so we could look at the conflicts in Africa at the time as communism versus freedom or democracy. Meanwhile, these are very personal conflicts going on with these tribes that predate any political system that we're talking about.
Even when we look at cultures that are closer to us, Poland, Ukraine, you mentioned these places,
Yeah.
they have historical
Right.
beef going on
Right.
there. It does go beyond our comprehension a lot of times.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we don't go to war. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
you need to factor in in the nuances. In fact, for a foreign intelligence officer, allied or friendly, or not so friendly, stationed in Washington, D.C. or at the UN or here across the river, the U.S. is a very complex society.
Yeah.
And it don't, just because we make good movies and people watch the movies, they assume they know us, and we have issues.
Right.
Before we move on from Angola, I want to ask you how it wound down for you, but I also got to ask, do you have any hand or anything you can talk about as far as interesting ops that you guys ran in Angola? I've heard some pretty cool stories about training Angolans to do sabotage operations and things that were done to mess with the enemy.
I will say that once we were going to give them some maritime training and we needed to know if they could swim. Back to my
important, yeah.
My recruitment into Recon battalion, could I swim? And all of them said yes. And let's say a platoon. And Special Forces legend was down there at the time, Ron Franklin. And
oh yeah.
We had to, we found a river and we would have them swim across it. Just as a simple test, maybe 25 meters, not much current. We did throw hand grenades in just to flush out crocodiles, right? There weren't any, and 2 or 3 people needed to have their lives saved. I mean, it was sheer terror, panic, and I think back at it. I'm not pretending it's a big deal, and I don't want any credit for it, but I kind of hung onto a root on the bank of the river and stuck my big long body out, my big boot, and I grabbed it and I pulled him out. Mm-hmm. And he just, he wasn't going to make it as a surface swimmer somewhere. So.
Were you able to identify an effective, force eventually, though?
Correct. That I would have to say, and very little corruption, right? And that really was a pleasure working with those insurgents, and mm-hmm. they believed in their cause, and they were extraordinarily austere conditions.
Yes,
our mail was World War II technology. We would get mail once every 2 or 3 weeks. A 2-week-old Washington Post was fun to read. We got our news through the radio, shortwave. Yeah. So,
how did it wind down for you in '88? Where was the conflict at by the time you were taking off?
So, as I recall, there had been gains for the insurgents, slight. Probably, I'll use the same analogy: 20 steps forward, 19 back, and the Soviet and communist forces were not going to wipe out 1/3 of the population of an embedded insurgency with a safe haven across the border.
Right.
Yeah.
And
You were making this costly for them.
yes, and there was, because of Vietnam, and I mentioned me being in the 70s and learning so much from those who had sacrificed so much over there, that it gave me, frankly, great professional pleasure to slow bleed the Soviets in revenge for what they did in Vietnam, which was a flood of military hardware to the Viet Cong and NVA to maim,
Yeah.
to kill and maim our soldiers.
It really is interesting because you bring up a point that I don't think's been brought up on the show before, because we've talked about insurgencies and counterinsurgencies, but you talk about the idea of an insurgency that has a safe haven
Yeah.
across the border. And you look at Vietnam, I mean, we even look at Afghanistan, like you look at these places where the insurgents can simply flow back to a place where they are unbothered, unhassled, and essentially untouchable in another country.
In
And-
Africa, it's even worse.
Yeah.
too, because the
can
borders
tell you
barely
his name-
exist.
Yeah.
His name was Mr. Marsh, and I think he was a Mac
MacVsog, yeah.
MacVsog,
Yeah.
an SF legend. He may have been a sergeant major, and he came over to Ground Branch. And very early on, he was in eastern Afghanistan, and he pointed at Pakistan and said, "That's Cambodia." And it was kind of, it's chilling,
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
chilling. And it was.
Yeah.
That's Cambodia.
Yeah.
So you're out of Angola, and now you get into the foreign intelligence stuff. How does that take place?
So in my experience, and there might be other examples, but in the 1980s, for a case officer certified paramilitary officer, it was important to do what was called an FI rotational. And it was important for the agency, it was important for mission, it was important for the officer. And I think too many of them probably went to a certain Latin American country that had its own insurgency at the time. And I think I'll say that Mr. Escobar spent a lot of time in that country.
Right.
I really thought that was really only half of an FI assignment.
Right. Right.
And it was good that they went PCS, and it's good that they were in an embassy, traditional embassy, and it was good that they learned the language, Spanish, really. And so it's good. But if I'm going to do an FI rotation, I'm going to Europe. And I'm going to be, I'm not going to be working with the local service. And that's why I'll be vague on the country. But that was more classic espionage. The wall was still up, so it was Soviet Union, Communist China, Communist North Korea, Communist Cuba, and Islamic Iran. Islamic terrorism was not on the radar at the time.
You were going
and it
after
should have
hard
been.
targets.
I was.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we had the hijackings in the 70s, and but terrorism had kind of fallen by the wayside, right?
I think so.
As
Correct.
in terms of like a real strategic focus.
Well, of course, Buckley and the Marine Barracks,
Right.
And,
Yeah,
and the
that's right.
birth
That's
of Hezbollah. But at least for me, in the European country, it was very traditional tradecraft, and frankly, it was my third tour, but it was really like my first, because I was now wearing a suit and tie, and it is different.
So it's I think it's a good time to
Plug our sponsors?
no to go. Do we have sponsors? No, to go
Can I have
to
that
go
lighter-
back
Can I
to
have that lighter, please?
yeah.
Thank you.
to go back to the question you asked though
About the stigma around foreign intelligence
right,
versus
because
PM.
this is where that really comes to play. right?
Let me go ahead and just plug our Patreon first for a second. I just want to let people know that if you subscribe to our Patreon, and there's a link down in the description, you get access to all these episodes ad-free, and we really appreciate you supporting the show. We also have a second podcast that's more current events, national security, things that are in the news, called Eyes On, hosted by Andy Milburn and Jason Lyons. And also, please check out our friends at Casa Carabeo Cigars. You can find them at casacarabeo.com. Another great Cuban-American SF veteran who owns that company. Okay, so let's jump back to your point about the stigma that was following around guys like you at that time in foreign intelligence.
So I will welcome views to the contrary from colleagues who didn't have the experience I did, but this was post-Vietnam and 1980s, and there was still a knuckle-dragger stereotype, and even though they had a certificate to do full-cycle human recruiting, maybe it wasn't their strength. And maybe they weren't necessarily welcomed in a more traditional station.
And how did you cope with that?
So I coped with it by being the first one in the office in the morning and the last one to leave at night. And I had to work harder to be equal. And if I would say that if I made a minor contribution in my career to paramilitary officers who later enjoyed easier access to the FI world, maybe I helped just
shoulder the door open a little.
just a little bit.
Yeah.
Just a little bit. I remember one instance, I was in the office staying late as usual. I wasn't married, right? Same with El Salvador and Angola. So that's why, another reason for the PCS and not TDY, by the way. And in Europe, and there was this is before iPhones and internet, so there was a walk-in, which is a very, very big deal for CIA. And the chief of station and the SIS ranks came down a floor to the bullpen of case officers. I was in there alone. And he was talking to the deputy, and he said, "We have a walk-in. Who's here?" And the deputy said, "Only Dale." And the chief of station said, "I don't want that knuckle dragger going near this case. It might be something important." And so I remember that. And but he had no choice, and I did fine. I'm not saying I did anything remarkable.
But you did your job.
I did my job,
Yeah.
and the language skills helped. There was a low-intensity conflict connection to this particular walk-in, so I may have been well suited for that. And I like to think that proving that I could do it, maybe that convinced other chief of stations and other FI leadership that, hey, some of these op-certified, case officer certified paramilitary officers, give them a chance.
Did that help, or did that chief of station in particular kind of like become a little more open-minded after all that?
I don't think so.
Well, it can't hurt to try.
No, I don't think so. And I think that maybe today some might not even be aware of that history. But then after 11 September, when foreign intelligence really mixed with the PM world, that our op-certified paramilitary officers really became first-class citizens.
Mm-hmm.
Then it became almost
and maybe some FI officers serving in places like Paraguay were the second-class citizens, because you had to know a little bit about low-intensity
became
conflict.
the focus. Yeah.
SAD and CTC,
Yeah.
correct? So I'm very proud of that.
So it almost went from being like the redheaded stepchild to being like the prodigal child, where it gave you bona fides wherever else you went later on.
We really needed those guys post 11 September, and just in time. And they did remarkable work. By that time, 11 September, I had transitioned to pure pure FI. So it was their turn, and I'm very, very pleased that so many of them succeeded.
Now, in the agency back in those days, was there the concept of like the hardship tour that you had to do in order to further your career? And was SAD considered that?
No, so I want to be fair on the definition of hardship.
Okay.
Because the Beijing, Havana, Moscow crowd, that's hardship.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and they are the pinnacle of hard skills, different.
Right.
But if you can do that, that is, I've always been impressed with those guys. I did not.
Yeah. But in terms of like going to a location that people didn't want to go to,
Post 11 September, yes, it was important, and you almost had to have done it.
what about before 9/11?
Also similarly.
Was that a thing? Like you have to go to Paraguay, or you have to go someplace people don't really want to go. I don't know if people want to go to Paraguay, but you can't just do the European embassy circuit. You have to do something that people don't want to do in order to advance your career, or things like that.
Particularly post 11 September.
Okay.
And what, of course, happened is, and maybe similar to our DoD brothers and sisters, was that as the GWAT continued, many people became very senior in the director of operations, and maybe they were less impressed with Lisbon or Milan,
Right.
and more impressed with Kandahar
Right.
or Niger.
Right.
Um,
Because I think it's important to note, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I might be wrong, but in the military, when you get orders, you get orders. When your unit's moving out somewhere, like you don't get to say, this isn't really for me. In the agency, though, I mean, it's a civilian organization, so they can give you an assignment, but you can also say no, correct?
don't, excuse me, but don't make it a pattern.
Okay.
That will hurt your career. I think as I, towards the latter part of my career, spent time in Europe. It was an operational or tactical reason I preferred Europe, and I'll tell you that in a minute. But as I moved more to Europe, I think I got something of a pass because of the hardship I did early on.
Interesting.
Now, by the time we get to 1991, well, maybe before we move on to Peru, just one last question about that initial FI rotations that you did in Europe. I mean, were you over there when the wall came down? I mean, I got to ask you, what was that like?
That there's a kernel of truth to the stereotype that a Soviet, now Russian, lieutenant colonel, GRU, would show up at an embassy and offer his services, and we would say, no thanks, because we have a 2-star in the walk-in room. Okay, so, we probably could have done better. But these were extraordinarily hectic days with worldwide ramifications on our operations. And remember, the CIA was created in part because of Pearl Harbor, but really to contain the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. That was the main enemy, and that's really all we did. Any embassy anywhere would focus on the Soviet Union. The Russian speakers were assigned to Niamey, Niger, for example.
I got the impression reading Milt Bearden's book that like when the wall came down, it sort of like reshuffled the deck of cards in everyone's mind. And they all had to adapt like very, very quickly to this literally a new world that, especially as a CIA officer that you're living in.
It was extraordinarily hard for the operations officers who had served in those very difficult locations behind the wall, and with all the tradecraft that requires that I was never qualified to do, and then worry about an SFES or a VBID.
Right.
That
Right.
is a revolutionary shift
Yeah.
in focus, and many of them just couldn't do it.
Right, because you talk about the advanced training, and it was it like high threat, like it had a specific name, and the threat wasn't a suicide bomber. The threat was that country, the country that you were in, like their intelligence service, like disclose, finding your assets and like it was a major shift, right?
Yes, that's correct. And remember, threat. There's a CI threat.
Right.
That can get your asset killed, and then there's a high threat terrorist threat that could get the case officer killed.
Right.
And they're different.
Right.
And it's hard to be good at both.
Right.
Some remarkable officers where I wasn't one of them. I want to say that right.
Yeah.
So by the time we get to 91, though, it sounds like you're back into the fray down in Peru,
Correct.
dealing with Shining Path.
Correct. So this was, I think, that I was extraordinarily fortunate, but maybe the right officer in the right place at the right time, because I'd like to think I just didn't serve in El Salvador. I really believed in the counterinsurgency mission, and I wanted to understand counterinsurgency, and I wanted to be a counterinsurgent and be good. And then in Southern Africa, I wanted to understand insurgency and be an insurgent, and I wanted to be really good. So, studying Che and Trinquier and anything and everything on low intensity conflict that I could read, and then I got to practice it in those both locations. And then, but still, I wasn't an A-team commander. I was a CIA case officer,
Right.
and I got to hone the pure human, the pure espionage piece in Europe, and even under the nose of host services. So I took all that, and now I was in my mid-30s, because human and counterinsurgency are not necessarily young men, young women's games. And I took all that with me, and I was still single, so I could be a workaholic, opening the station and closing the station, as I did every station I ever worked in for 31 years. And I read everything, and I was gifted with competent Peruvian partners, and we took the fight to Sendero Luminoso on their own turf and decapitated the insurgency. And I'm very proud of that.
Well, talk to us again. I'm going to ask you some of the same framing questions that I asked about El Salvador and Angola. What was the Shining Path insurgency in Peru at the time?
So they were Maoist, which complicated it because they weren't Marxist-Leninists. They weren't loyal to the Soviet Union. And they were rural-based. And for students of
Oh, that's why they were
counterinsurgency,
Maoist.
beg your pardon?
That's why they were Maoist, because they were rural.
Correct.
Based.
Yeah.
Correct, Jack. Very good point. From studying counterinsurgency and studying counterterrorism, that just like we make mistakes, bad guys make mistakes too. And Abimel Reynoso Guzman presumptuously thought that the insurgency was ripe enough that he could move from the rural to the urban. And I think it was T.E. Lawrence, I'm not sure, I might be wrong on that, but to have a successful insurgency, you don't need 10% of the population with you. You just need 10% of the population to look the other way when you're conducting your operations.
Right.
And Lima wasn't ready for Guzman, and there was a $10,000 reward for his head in 1991 Third World, 1991, 92 Third World Peru. And that's a fortune for most Limeños, Peruvians. And of course, I had very good Spanish, now almost at the 4 level.
And you're very, a fluent Spanish speaker, very well versed in the history of insurgency and counterinsurgency. It sounds like maybe you took some of the Phoenix program concepts down there.
But I just couldn't tell anybody.
Right.
You couldn't say that out loud, yeah.
That's correct. But this was urban. And the advantage was me working in an embassy and living in the city, I could get to we could look for that clandestine infrastructure, and we found it, and we were able to take them down.
Take them. I mean, how did you take them down? Was there a sort of like counter propaganda effort or
Human
direct
source,
action?
a human source, and then but human sources tell half truths, and human sources
Right.
dissemble, and human sources fabricate, and for all sorts of motivations. I will also say at this stage, I should add that in between all of this, I had an assignment at headquarters where I worked the Cuban issue, and I was exposed to the Cuban double agent program, where the communist Cubans were running. We thought we were recruiting sources in Cuba, and they were double agents. And there's books written on this, but I got a firsthand look at that, and I did spend time with the defector, the Cuban defector, who revealed all these double agents. The tradecraft went into it. So I was also very good at counterintelligence, particularly in Latin America, and then with the counterinsurgency experience and some paramilitary experience and my case officer skills. So it sort of all came together, and none of that is lost on your hosts partners, because they'll see a charlatan. I mean, they'll know you're thin, or you're not. And I went to their weddings, and I went to their funerals, and I went to the 15th birthday of their daughters, and got drunk with them, and I was very close to my brother's Peruvian brothers and sisters.
It's interesting to me that because this was not a special activities assignment. This was a FI assignment. Correct?
Counterterrorism.
Right. Oh, counterterrorism. But that's also like counterterrorism is also, at the time they're recruiting traditional case. They're not recruiting like SADs, right?
No. I would have been the only officer in a rather medium-sized station who had at one time served in Ground Branch.
And so you're going into an environment that relies heavily on those skills, or at least that knowledge for context, that knowledge for rapport, things like that. But this is something that most case officers, most traditional FI case officers, cannot bring to this setting.
That's true. That's correct. I wanted to say that I want to give a shout out to the agency. There was a course that I took before I went to Peru. It was called CODA, Covert Operations in a Dangerous Area. So this is a decade before 11 September, and it was high threat.
How to work in like a Beirut in '83 kind of environment.
But maybe the Philippines, and there was a lot happening in Greece, and certainly Beirut, and it was the 38 short barrel for the ankle, and still the Browning high power, and I thought the 38 on the ankle was extraordinarily applicable to the case officer, maybe not the a tier 1 special operator. I'm sure it didn't happen in Afghanistan or Iraq, but Ukraine or Libya. But for the case officer, you're going to be seated in the car a lot.
Right.
And it was extraordinarily accessible.
Right.
And I'm not saying I'm a gunslinger.
Surreptitiously pull it out,
Right. And, or hotel meeting.
Yeah.
Extraordinarily accessible because you're seated so very often. In fact, I probably spent, it seemed like years of my life sitting in a car.
Yeah.
And years of my life sitting in a hotel.
Yeah. Well,
and years of my
and waist
life.
carriers are horrible to draw in a car. Like they're so hard to draw.
I don't know. But the instructors were excellent. When to shoot, when not, and there was and the narco wars were happening, and so it was an absolutely fantastic course.
So it's interesting because the agency formed the CTC based on the idea that we need to track terrorists, and we have people who are specialized in that and begin to understand the patterns. Did the agency ever have like a counterinsurgency center where they maintained that knowledge?
I think
of how
that there was a small analytical cell of a couple of people, probably Vietnam veterans, and I think it withered.
yeah.
And that's a shame.
Which is wild because so much of the agency's business was in that arena.
I am sure that in South Vietnam there were case officers, paramilitary officers, meeting human sources, and I would love to know their tradecraft and how they did it.
Yeah.
Communications.
Yeah.
And not necessarily of the NVA, no,
Right.
full-time regulars, but the Viet Cong, that clandestine infrastructure, nurse, villager,
Yeah.
and
Taxi driver.
Yeah.
and the and the university professor.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because John. Who did we have on that was Phoenix?
John Mullins.
John Mullins, right? And and to have that knowledge to like work consistently against that infrastructure, and then to let that knowledge go.
And that you guys didn't benefit from in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's one of the reasons I'm here tonight,
Yeah.
is to pass on some of this. I want to mention in Peru a leadership lesson that I'd like to share.
Sure.
What not to do. That after the takedown of Guzman, I was rather popular, and I was promoted and was even offered an onward assignment as chief of station. Small post, but still. I was at the military attaché's house. He was a bachelor like me, and we'd often socialize together. And he had an army buddy was visiting from Washington, and this, like quite a few people in those days, wanted to come and talk to me about the successful operation. And I was more than happy to go on and on about the success. I thought that much of the world revolved around me, and probably to an extent in that little world it did.
Right.
So in this particular evening I was going on for about 10 minutes, and the man I was talking to I was in my 30s. This man was probably early 60s. This is in Lima, and it was a one-on-one conversation, and I said to him at a certain point, "Excuse me, I didn't catch your name." He said, "My name is Dick Meadows." So I nodded, and here I was talking about myself, and Dick Meadows didn't talk about himself, didn't even introduce himself. So I went into the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and said, "Never do that again." And I'd like to think I never talked about myself in that way. Again, maybe for your audience, you might give a line on Mr. Meadows, who he is, and
I mean, Special Forces legend, served in Vietnam. He was on the Sun Tay raid.
He was on the
wasn't he?
Sun Tay raid, yeah.
And he went on and played a role in Iran undercover, gathering intelligence in the run-up to Eagle Claw.
there are not many statues at Special Forces headquarters at Fort Bragg, except Dick Meadows' statue.
Yeah, he's out in front of USASOC. We looked it up.
So,
yeah, and it's, it's interesting because it's not, like, I understand where you were at in that moment. You had helped to facilitate the takedown of,
High five, man.
yeah, of like the dude, of like the major player, and in the agency, which is small, like that has, it reverberates, right? It's a major thing.
boots on the ground. None. No need for
light footprint.
10th Mountain. No need for 19 or 20-year-olds from 10th Mountain Division.
Right.
The other point that I want to, leadership lesson I would like to pass on from Peru is, I'm in my 60s now, but I have a mentor in his 80s, and his name is Felix Rodriguez, another patriotic Cuban American who's of Che Guevara fame. Felix would never say he captured Che Guevara. He doesn't use that language. He says He assisted in the capture. So I want to say that I assisted in the capture of Ibrahim Guzman. So that's important.
Can you tell us a little bit about Guzman, and then sort of
How you
whatever
guys nailed
whatever
him.
you're comfortable revealing about the events leading up to his capture?
So I will say what's in the press, and so human is fragile. It's critical, but it's fragile. And was the source telling the truth? But let's see. And trash analysis played a huge role because of surveillance of the safe house keepers. They never smoked, yet there were cigarette butts. I guess with more modern technology, we would have been able to get a DNA read of those cigarette butts. Then also the lack of anything electronic coming or going. And then there were a few documents in English that I helped translate. And enough is enough. We're going to go and we're going to raid this house. And just like with the Cuban pilots in Angola, it matters to win these insurgencies, these counterinsurgencies, that you can't just be brutal. You have to be smart as well.
Yeah.
And
Surgical.
yeah, and they spared this third world police force with a notorious reputation, spared his life. They probably could have found an excuse that he was Bin Laden, like reaching for
Right.
reaching for a weapon.
Right.
And he died in prison probably, I think, a year or two ago.
And when you look back on it, was that the decisive point that sort of broke the back of this organization?
That's correct, because it's with insurgency, counterinsurgency, it's mowing grass or whack-a-mole,
Right,
correct,
right.
With leadership. But I think if it's not just the leader, but if it's the founder and leader, it can have a profound, a founder leader, profound effect. A Bin Laden takedown, this issue with Sendero Luminoso, that they're, and also just to let the population know, the neutrals, that these people aren't, these insurgents aren't 10 feet tall. They're
Right.
because they were sort of
but it's interesting that these
phantom-like.
these decapitation strikes don't always work,
No, they
right? Like
No,
on a
they don't.
strategic level. We tried in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Ho Chi Minh died of natural causes during the war, and
Yeah.
Viet Cong, NVA pressed on. So
Right.
Not always. Right.
And why do you think this one of Guzman? Why do you think that was different? I mean, you mentioned he was a founder, but also there had to be other inputs.
I think also maybe, as we saw in Afghanistan, that in insurgencies, that back to T.E. Lawrence, the non-combatant, but sort of trying to determine which way the wind's blowing in the insurgency, and with a blow like this, that hey,
okay,
you
the
know, I'm not
population
gonna
was
get
already on the fence.
yeah, and hey, I'm not going to get involved
Gotcha.
because the Peruvian police are actually quite effective. Might get killed or captured, and again, they were not 10 feet tall. They were flesh and blood.
Do you think part of it Maoism, does a Maoist ideal, an agrarian, or communism based on agrarianism or whatever, does it lack appeal to the general populace if it's an urban country?
So it's a very good question. I spent a lot of time looking at that. There's, well, frankly, in our own country, you have a rural-urban divide, right? And but it's exacerbated.
Yeah.
And when you add a third world, because the
Poverty. And
it's the rich are almost as rich as our rich, and the poor are, well, frankly, they're making their way to the southern U.S. border because of the dire situation. And just like I told you that in Africa, we often look at those rather symmetrical borders that Europeans drew,
Right.
and not paying attention to the tribes. In Peru, it's understated and it's a sensitive subject, but there's also a racial dimension. And fair-skinned people tend to be higher socioeconomically, and they're coastal. And people more indigenous, with indigenous features, tend to be in the Altiplano, in the Andes. And mestizos, of course, are a mix of the two, correct? But Guzman's safe house keepers were as white as the three of us,
Wow.
Peruvians. And that mattered because a mestizo cop is not going to stop a fair-skinned Peruvian walking around Miraflores or San Isidro, the Upper East Side, or the Chelsea or Tribeca of Lima.
Was that indicative of some sort of like a bourgeois leadership inside the organization?
Correct.
Okay.
And remember that, you got Quechua, it's a completely different language, and
Yeah.
And they were living in a rather nice house, right? So
It's very interesting.
So
yeah, very interesting.
after all of that, you then got a chief of station position,
Correct.
which was a huge promotion for an agency officer.
It's the saying goes, regardless of how small it is, always take your first chief's job, because it can lead to others.
Yeah.
And I was back in Southern Africa.
And what was that like now that you're running the whole station
So
as a knuckle dragger?
So correct, and there weren't many, and PCS with the language and good skills, but very focused on the wall's down now. So I'll say Russia, not China. I'll say Russia, not Soviet Union. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and a lot of Cuba, and still no Islamic Jihad in '93, 4, and 5.
But you're still, I mean, that's interesting. Like, I never really thought about North Korea in regards to Angola, like that they have interests in that country.
Significant.
Really? I was unaware of that.
Angola, like Mozambique, was coming out of communist. I should say Angola, communist. Jose Eduardo dos Santos was in power, I think, 30 or 40 years. Yeah. 30, 35.
And I mean, anything you can or want to tell us about your first chief of station position?
So only a few less people than I have on this hand, but it's command nevertheless. If Jack and Dave, that I think Mr. Devine was sitting here and he explained that on the foreign intelligence side, it's quite a bit more sensitive.
Yeah.
And it's easy to talk about the counterterrorism or paramilitary operation because there was a boom.
Right.
Makes
Right.
the papers.
So,
Yeah.
that's sensitive, and I'll pass if that's okay.
Yeah, no, of course, I get
Absolutely.
it.
Thank you.
So after that, you're off to continue your education at the Naval War College.
Correct. I really enjoyed it. I studied counterinsurgency and insurgency.
Surprise, surprise.
So it's interesting to me because I don't know at what rank naval officers or Marine officers go to Naval War College, but here you are, somebody with real world insurgency and counterinsurgency experience. What did you think of the courses when you took them?
I want to give a shout out to my uniformed brothers and sisters because they were just coming from Gulf War I. And to a man and a woman, they said, let's study every other war, but don't study that one because we're never going to be given such a
Straightforward mission.
Straightforward mission, conventional, and with such lead time for the logistics. So I was really impressed.
Yeah.
And I really got to read Mao and Clausewitz, and I think I want to, again, what DOD does right is it's mid-level, so I was a GS-14, so there were lieutenant colonels.
Right.
And, or commanders in the Navy, and so you brought 10 to 15 years of practical experience, and now you can maybe look at it at a more strategic level. And I think that the saying goes, I think in uniform or for civilian, that you really don't put a lot of that education to practice as a GS 14 or 15, as a 05 or 06. But once you get into the flag rank, you start looking back on it. And indeed, when I was the deputy of a component in Washington, at CIA headquarters, I would dial back some of my leadership notes and lessons learned from the Naval War College.
But I'm curious about, because you're talking about commanders and lieutenant colonels who have a lot of experience, but not in insurgency, counterinsurgency, not in their respective fields. And you're also probably dealing with professors who are subject matter experts, but but maybe haven't been on the ground in these. And you are bringing a lot of real world experience, having been personally involved in these. So I'm curious as to, outside of, the classic texts like Clausewitz and whatnot, what was your experience like, and how was your interaction with your professors and with your peers and things like that?
So I was a guest there. It's their school, but heavily focused on carrier battle groups. Right, and they love the Falklands War. Submarines, Marines.
Navy got to play a role.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Marines.
Right.
Interesting war, and what I did learn from that, and I passed it on to other officers, and through all my insurgency, counterinsurgency experience, was a country can be third world. It's true. But elites from that country are as elite as any of us.
Right. They've gone to our universities.
AQCon and nukes, and don't ever underestimate third world elites. They are us.
Yeah.
Maybe with our Cuban double agent debacle, we fell for a banana republic stereotype, and they are as good as we are.
Yeah.
I mean, we mentioned some of the amazing Cuban Americans who have contributed to national security, but for the grace of God and timing, they may have been there.
Yeah.
Right.
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 How would you like Felix Rodriguez to be the Minister of Interior,
Right.
No thanks.
running the intel service?
Yeah.
Or Rick Prado.
Or Rick Prado being like
Yeah, no.
part of their.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're lucky to have them, right? So,
Right.
but they are two great examples.
Yeah, yeah.
That don't do that. My point is, I bring that in the Malvinas or Falkland context because the Argentine pilots,
Right.
not the Argentine troops, who were used to taking batons and bashing in the heads of student protesters or disappearing the econ professor at some university.
Right.
But now you're going up against SAS and Royal Marines, and but the Argentine pilots. I mean, I think Sheffield they sunk a ship, right?
There was a ship sunk. Yeah.
That's so serious.
And then off to headquarters, and you got to learn French.
I learned French, and went to a French-speaking country in the heart of Europe as the number 3.
Huh.
And I was more Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and Cuba. And now let me say that Islamic Jihad started percolating, particularly in Europe, where there's a big Maghreb population. So we began to track that. In defense of CIA, we were looking at that well before 11 September.
I'd like to ask you, what did you think of your French-speaking liaison partners? As that intelligence service and their paramilitary guys seem to be kind of unusually aggressive for a Western European country. I was wondering if you had any thoughts or observations.
I thought that I think they make for excellent counterinsurgency and counterterrorism partners. Different systems. We do some things better. They might do some things better, but they have an amazing history when it comes to counterinsurgency. And you mentioned West Africa or the Maghreb, but don't forget Southeast Asia, when our early Vietnamese special forces advisors, I think some of them were reading maps in French, or the
I think you're right.
The Vietnamese elite spoke spoke French, and there's also French in the Levant. So it's a very important language. And Roger Trinquier, is a really worth a read for insurgency, counterinsurgency. Remember
is he
the French?
the one who wrote the Centurions?
No, no, that name escapes me. But Trinquier wrote a small pamphlet on Indochina and Algiers, where
okay.
the French may have won the battle for Algiers, but lost the war for Algeria.
Right.
And rolling raids based on HUMINT, harsh interrogations, a Western army, largely Christian, occupying a Arab country, majority Muslim. Tremendous lessons in there. In fact, the movie the battle for Algiers. There's an amazing ops test in there that could apply to insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, where the French turn a prisoner, where the insurgents want to recruit an Algerian, and they test him by giving him a pistol to assassinate a French police officer, but it's there's no no rounds in the revolver, and it's quite interesting. There's also scenes where Western Christian soldiers need to search women in burqas, and the women protest naturally for gender and Islamic sensitivities, but they were carrying
bombs and things.
bombs. And there's also the urban terror, and when does that become?
Yeah, this is a great movie.
And we've talked about it before on the show. In fact, we've talked about the spook is set by the door, and the idea that a lot of the, like in the 70s, a lot of the sort of homegrown terrorist organizations would use that movie as
we used that
as
movie.
training material. Yeah,
They showed it to us when we were in the Q course.
yeah, yeah. But
And also, if you're studying French, you can watch it, maybe, and remove subtitles and rewind it to work on your French. And it's particularly useful if you're in insurgency, counterinsurgency, because that's the vocabulary you're going to use. Remember, when it comes to the French and Africa, that, let me get this right, that if you are from, and I'm just going to pick one, if you're from Mali, and if you were born in 1964, you were born with a French passport. I don't care what color skin you wear, what religion, you have a French passport. And by the way, in Angola, if you were born in 1974, you were born with a Portuguese passport.
I know. I grew up around a lot of them after they left the country.
Yeah. In the Northeast?
Yeah, in the Northeast, here in Westchester County, New York. Portuguese families that came from Angola immigrated. Well, I'm sure they stopped in Portugal, but then immigrated to the United States.
Fall River.
Yeah. The Carnation coup.
Yes, correct.
So.
My wife's from Angola, by the way.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Married 29 years.
Wow.
I remember once I was with her when I was a chief of station in Europe, so rather senior, and the Cuban ambassador passed by, and I said to him, Mr. Senor, I never had a chance to thank you for your intervention in Angola. Without your intervention, I would not have met my wife of 25 years, and we have three beautiful children. And he said, because of that, you think we're close? I said, he said, we are as close as heaven is to hell. I walked away.
That's funny.
Okay, so your next assignment, I mean, this is a tough one, I know, but tell us about like where you were on 9/11.
Okay, sure. Yes, thank you. So I, after that European assignment, I came to New York to work closely with our FBI brothers and sisters, again on the harder targets, and everybody's in New York.
Right.
I'll tell one war story, but I'm going to blur the nationality.
Sure.
But this hard target liked to fish in the East River because
A brave man.
everything went in the stew pot, and they didn't have a lot of money. So we're going to fish in the East River as well, and right next to them, and maybe sort of develop a relationship. So we thought maybe even better, let's impress him somehow. So can we get a hold of a fish, hook it, and slip it in the water, and
Smart.
and look at the bait that we use. And so we even considered maybe touching base with NSW, and could we possibly have divers in the water and
Yeah, on draggers, yeah, on rebreathers, hooking your fish, yeah.
well, and
Yeah.
then
Smart.
so I said make sure it's something indigenous to these waters, and it's not an exotic
Sturgeon.
Right.
carp
yeah.
from
Yeah.
Thailand or
Yeah.
something, and
Yeah. a barracuda.
don't be a smart ass and
Yeah.
go down to buy a frozen fish and hook it to the line, have
Yeah.
a guy reel it in.
Yeah.
So, but it never came to pass. But excellent cooperation with our FBI brothers and sisters on that. So I, without going too many details why, but I happened to be in Tower 7 that day, and I happened to be looking out the window up Broadway, and only because I had to collect my thoughts because I was composing an email, did I notice a speck in the sky over Central Park, and I didn't think anything of it. I had only been in the city. I'm not from New York City. I'd only been in the city for 2 or 3 weeks, and that speck grew bigger. But I actually went back to my note because JFK, LaGuardia, Teterboro,
Yeah.
Newark,
Yeah.
who knows? But really only because I had to collect my thought again did I look out the window, and it was a 767 below the Empire State Building coming down Broadway directly for me.
Holy shit.
And there was probably 2 or 3 seconds when I thought, I guess I'm going to catch this in the chest. And but those 2 or 3 seconds passed, and I could see the belly of the aircraft, which meant it was above me. I mean, it sounds extraordinarily basic, but when your life's flashing before your eyes, basic is good.
Yeah.
And it roared over our building, which is the Solomon Building, I think 55 stories, and there was sort of a shudder. But I thought it was after just exhaust from the aircraft,
Right,
maybe
rattling.
a mechanical problem, and wasn't sure what to think of it. And then I thought it was female laughter, but then the second or third laugh was a scream. I said, damn, the aircraft. So was looking north up Broadway and went to look south towards the north face of Tower 1, and there was a gaping hole. And you know how narrow those streets are. So maybe 30, 40 meters, 50 meters apart. And in that instance, I recalled watching the plane, and now the windows are opaque, but I could tinted, but of course, if I could have seen it, was Muhammad Atta, who was crabbing slightly left to get dead center. And which mattered because then we didn't know, but they were gorged with avgas and flying from Boston, Muhammad Atta's flight from Boston to LA. And I was the number 3, so I talked to the chief of station, and she agreed that I would get a message out to Counter-terrorism Center. So I called Kofor Black, whom I happen to know, and he was in a meeting, but I said, I need to talk to him. I guess Rick Prado was with him, and he was the number 3 at the time. And I said, look, I can't say it's terrorism, but I can tell you it was an American airline 767. It was deliberate. The weather's perfect. And Mr. Black was silent. And then he asked another question. And at that moment, there was a fireball out the window, and it was the second plane had hit. So I wish I had a hero's story to tell. I don't. The first responders were the heroes, correct? And again, a shout out to our FBI brothers and sisters. We made our way to 26 Federal and hung out with the FBI. And then rather large, we have a rather large presence in New York. And then I'd like to thank our brothers and sisters from the Department of State who took us in the U.S. mission to the UN and cleared up the base and gave us a home.
Is that because your station was destroyed in the collapse?
It's a sensitive topic. I think I'll pass on that. Yeah.
You know, on a personal level, like this had a profound effect on you, correct?
Yeah, I'll have to take that to my grave. Correct. It was an intelligent Pearl Harbor before my eyes. Worse, civilian target. Worse, we had Pearl Harbor as an experience. So there was precedent. It's one thing to suffer strategic surprise, but not when there's precedent. This is what's eating at the Israelis right now because they had Yom Kippur, and now they have a strategic surprise. So.
Yeah, and you took it, and I'm just going off what you said prior to the show, so please correct me if I'm wrong about anything. But you took it personally because you feel as though this was the agency's bailiwick, and it was their wheelhouse, and they missed it.
How could you blame the FBI? How could you blame DIA? How could you blame our tier 1, 2, or 3 operators? How could you do that? So you have this intelligence failure, and I'm going to guess that 11 September, of course, led to Afghanistan. We get that, but it probably led to Iraq. Mm-hmm. Did you serve in Iraq?
I've been there, yeah.
Did you serve in Iraq?
Yeah. And, and you mentioned a little bit of, if you don't mind talking about it, you mentioned a little bit of survival skill. You mentioned a little bit of like moral injury.
Correct.
Can you talk a little bit about like what that is for you and how you're managing it, or how you have managed it?
Can I a little bit more scotch, please?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
you do a lot more scotch.
You asked how I'm managing it.
Do you want more ice?
No, I'm okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry. That's
No.
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah, obviously, extraordinarily humbling experience, and you're standing there in your Brooks Brothers suit, and you're a big bad CIA officer, and your civilian population depends on you to get it right, and you let them down like that tremendously. And in a certain way, I can feel for not so much Mossad, but Shin Bet for 7 October, politics aside. That a former director of operations said after that the CIA in 2001 had produced 10,000 intelligence reports. Really, we only needed one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Plans, intentions, and activities. Mm-hmm. The mystery, one of the many mysteries, is that if there had been reporting that 19 unarmed Arabs are going to drop the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and maybe Congress, that it may not have been disseminated because it was sensational. Mm-hmm. So,
which is exactly what we're hearing about the reports about Hamas, that there was accurate reporting that there was activity and potentially an imminent threat, and mid-level officers felt as though it was sensational reporting and fanciful.
Yes, I understand there was a FBI special agent, in this case a female, I think in Arizona, who famously reported that when we got a Middle Eastern out here who wants to learn to take off and fly but not land.
Right.
And she's a heroine. And I understand there was a female analyst in the IDF who something had bothered her. Correct. Yeah. So.
After 9/11, I mean, you got to go spend some time as an instructor at the farm.
Right, and I needed some stability after that.
Yeah.
I wish it weren't the case, and I want to thank my leadership at CIA for allowing me to do that. It's not always that you go there to be an instructor as a GS-15, a full colonel, when it's really a major or lieutenant colonal at most slot. And it also indicated that I probably was plateauing, and that was it for my career. And I didn't have any issues with that because I had failed. Remember when civilians reference they in the U.S. they, I was the they.
Yeah.
I was in Europe when Muhammad Atta was hatching this plot. Now it's an unfair burden, one officer, and I was busy and doing quite well against other targets that were important, but missed it.
Yep, but I mean, to play the devil's advocate, was there intel or was there a piece that you were privy to and ignored, or was this something that just never even came up on the radar?
That Islamic terrorism might be onesie-twosies.
Mm-hmm.
A drive-by, a hand grenade, and frankly, thank you, in fairness, Russia, China, Iran,
Right.
North Korea, and lesser but still Cuba. And these were important issues. I would say the other damage, the fallout from that intelligence failure, was that starting on 12 September, we started worrying about 19-year-old shitheads with S-vests.
Right.
And maybe, well, not maybe, I mean, just sheer numbers. I'm not saying we completely took our eye off of Russia or China or Iran or North Korea, but how could we?
Right.
How could we?
Right. Right.
You had to worry about a 19-year-old shithead with an S-vest.
Right.
An entire station, an entire liaison service.
Right. Yeah. And an S-vest is a suicide vest. Somebody wears it and clacks off. How do you not also, though, and I understand the idea that there was a CIA intelligence failure, but how do you also not also hold the FBI to some level of responsibility in the terms that, like you said, it was an FBI agent who had reported on this. The CIA doesn't have any lawful arrest authority here in the United States. The FBI, there were elements of the FBI that were aware of these people, and it stopped there. Like, how do you not share that burden and that responsibility with them?
We're an external service, and we have the lead, and this was a foreign plot by foreigners.
Yeah.
So the FBI, they're only as good as what we inform in this
No,
instance. In fairness to the Bureau.
I would disagree with that. I feel
It's
as
fair.
though
Some others do. I understand.
I feel as though the FBI really dropped the ball on this too. Like, yes, the agency missed, sort of the external piece of this.
Muhammad Atta was in Germany. We can get to him in Germany. He wasn't in Kandahar.
Yeah, no, I understand.
The problem is that a lot of it wasn't missed. Like, we actually did pick it up, but they did not coordinate all of the information and put together that there was this larger plot taking place.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. When I say missed, I mean like missed the opportunity.
We didn't need one of the 19 hijackers. Remember that clandestine infrastructure?
Right.
Somebody who to say, just like you didn't need a Hamas assassin, the cousin who's borrowed a motorcycle and is not telling what it's for, or hanging around new friends, or gone quiet.
Right. You know, it's interesting to me because, like I said, the FBI has the arrest authority here. There was a report sent up by one of their agents, and none of her higher-ups at any point, they either said, we don't want to focus on this individual or these individuals because they're Muslim and we don't want to appear to be, you know, xenophobic, or they said what? Like, okay, these people want to learn how to take off but not land. No problem. That's a perfectly normal request. That's a perfectly normal behavior pattern. You know, like, so I feel as though the FBI bears every bit as much of the responsibility as the agency for missing this.
The other mystery for me is that had we been on the Muhammad Atta and had the Bureau surveilled him, and they're excellent at that, especially in CONUS, where it's their turf. I think there's a possibility that they may have followed Muhammad Atta to Logan and allowed him to board, and let the Los Angeles field office be ready to receive him, and then see who he meets over there. And the same would have happened.
There's been a lot of stuff that's come out over the subsequent years as things are declassified, that these guys were meeting with Saudi intelligence operatives and things like. There's some weird stuff that
I really don't have my arms around. I understand. I've heard that story. I really don't have my arms around it.
Yeah, I mean, people can look it up for themselves. I mean, some
Correct.
of the stuff that's been declassified. But I mean, you had an amazing career at CIA, went up to senior intelligence staff, and then when you retired, you went right back to contracting for the agency and did some pretty cool things there too.
I'd like to think, because I think in part because of 11 September, I needed to give back a little bit, because maybe I could have done better that day or before, but it's just a personal feeling. And that I also liked, when I was retired and contracting, I was able to be very tactical. So when I was rather senior, I was in many high-level meetings at the cabinet level, sitting in the back, never not pretending I was at the table, but backbenching, and I thought a lot of those more strategic discussions were rather boring. And I really always was a tactical person. And as a contractor, I was able to be tactical. And I'd like to think I made continue to make a minor contribution with sort of meeting some of our problematic human sources, and maybe turning a mediocre source good, or even a good source great, and maybe tightening things up when it comes to dissembling, withholding information, or even outright fabricating.
Is this? I've heard that we have a program or a project where it's like our very top human guys are kind of sent after the types of people you're talking about for vetting and.
Jack, because human is not a young person's game, and I contend that a serious case officer really doesn't reach his or her prime until their 40s, and the reason for that is espionage is a window into the soul,
right?
Right, and that you have to have some empathy, and you have to mirror image, and you have to have been passed over for promotion,
right?
And you have to have a mortgage, and you have to, maybe you're not happy with the sexual orientation of what you expected your child's sexual orientation to be, or whatever, right. Or you buried a loved one, or you're dealing with a medical issue. When you're 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, you tend not to have those experiences.
Right.
And I just think I went down the list of what can really motivate. And I'm not talking about a confidential informant sort of snitch. I'm talking about a serious spy in place.
You're talking about
the gift that keeps giving.
About building that rapport, but in order to build that rapport, it can't be fake. You have to have true empathy, and that person has to know you get them.
And I would add to it, and this is something I did wrong, and I would like to think that I imparted it on my students when I was an instructor, that remember, comport yourself seriously and professionally when you're out and about town or even at a diplomatic reception, particularly, that a potential spy, someone who wants to commit treason against their country and spy for the United States, might be sizing you up as their potential handler, and it's a life or death situation for him and his family.
Right, right.
And so are you flirting with the Swedish third secretary, and are you pounding your chest about what you did in El Salvador or Southern Africa? Are you drinking too much? Are you informally dressed when everyone else is wearing a tie? That take it serious. And I probably could have done when I was in my European assignment. On the rare occasion, I probably could have been more professional. Nothing negative, but that's really important, an important aspect. And I think that 25 or 45, and the 25-year-old's going to go out to the club later that night, and the 45 is going to go home, and you need to commit treason, you might want to talk to the 45-year-old.
Yeah. It makes sense. I mean, it's like if you walked into an attorney's office and the attorney, to defend you in a case, and they're either wearing a suit, they're sitting there in a T-shirt with Dorito powder on their lips. It's like, it honestly does not speak to their competency, but it's
right.
Who am I trusting?
You're talking about like maintaining that professionalism, even in smaller things that maybe.
And these people face jail or potential execution if you're not competent in your job of protecting them while they are spying.
A deal breaker.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a very good summary.
Yeah.
That. Yeah, and I lived it, and it's extraordinarily important. I do know that, as I understand it, the KGB and SVR are extraordinarily formidable, noble adversary for many, many years. That for their big cases, such as an Ames, a particularly senior graybeard would go out and maturely handle the asset.
Right.
Because remember, agents are humans, and there's all kinds of foibles and ups and downs, and being avuncular is very important.
Yeah, especially when you're recruiting a member of a foreign intelligence service, like they know the game.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's a totally different type of target.
It's important.
Yeah.
And I mean, you understandably, I mean, I get it why you had to kind of beat around the bush a little bit, but I mean, it sounds like you had quite a bit of experience pitching and recruiting agents around the world.
Next question. Better than many, but not as good as some.
Sure,
Yeah.
Okay?
sure.
And there's extraordinary officers out there with special skills. That are, whether it's a foreign language or something technical, and I've always been very, always wished I could do what they did, but I just.
But it sounds like the agency brought you in as one of those guys that could do some vetting on, I think as you described it, potentially problematic sources.
I mentioned why I gravitated to Europe, and when you spend years in Europe, other officers tend to make fun of you because life can be nice there, but I also did it as a 6'4", 245-pound white male that I couldn't walk around Lima.
Right.
I can't.
Right.
Yeah.
I can't walk around Bangkok. I can't. I can walk around Berlin and Brussels
Right.
and Paris and Vienna and the UK. I can't. Even Madrid, or Italy. I can't. And that's. I'll never be a gray man, but I'm not shocking people either.
Right.
I remember when I was in interrogating an insurgent in El Salvador, I was asking age of an insurgent comandante. I wanted information, and I said age, eye color, etc., and tall. And he said, yeah, tall. But, the guy wasn't very sophisticated, and probably didn't know a lot about even feet or inches and even meters. But I said tall, and I stopped. I said tall like me. He said no, tall like normal people, not not you. In fact, I had an anecdote to this guy. He was so unsophisticated. We took him for a helicopter ride, and we landed. It was only about 5 minutes, and we landed at our base. We had an American flag there at our fob, and he looked. He said, "Oh, we're in the United States." I said, "No, dude, a 5 minute helicopter ride from the jungle of Central America. No, just no concept." Right?
Yeah.
But that's a lot of SF people and agency paramilitary officers have dealt with that lack of sophistication in the developing world.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember you had some funny stories.
Yeah,
Dave,
but like,
about
like you know,
the
showing
Keebler
them,
elf.
huh?
The Keebler elf.
Yeah. But also just showing them imagery, like showing them a top down of 2 or 3 blocks of their village, and it's like they just cannot conceptualize what they're looking at.
And it's our burden to
Yeah,
work
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
And then you also, during this time, also spent some time on black sites.
So I was Director of Counter-terrorism deputy, then the Chief of Operations, and the Chief of Operations had 2 deputies. I was one of the 2 deputies, and so I had peripherally was involved in some of that. And since you bring it up, I want to give a shout out to 2 elements that I think did tremendous damage to this global Islamic insurgency of Al-Qaeda. And the first one's the SEAL teams, because they ruthlessly pursued that enemy, and they smelled the enemy. I understand all sorts of other units were involved, but there was a laser focus of those guys on the enemy. And then CIA's rendition, harsh interrogation, smelled the enemy, and the men, SEALs men, but quite a few ladies, men and women of CIA really took it to the enemy. And both of those units took some heat for trying to make it fit within this liberal democracy of ours.
Right.
Probably took it just about to the limit that our society and our laws would accept. And there was some maybe a step or 2 over bounds on occasion. But does it make sense?
Yeah,
So
and
please push back if you.
I was actually gonna say, it's an unpopular opinion, but when it comes to what they call the enhanced interrogation or harsh interrogation, I agree with you, and I would like to hear your ideas on people who call it torture, or people who say it was not effective. I'd like to hear your experience or your ideas on that.
Sure. You'll have a vehement counter-argument from me, basically along the grounds of, in the fall of 2001 and all of 2002, it wasn't if, it was when, and we weren't going to let it happen. Clearly, in the winter and spring of 2024, I understand those arguments, but you have to.
I remember the fear of that time. Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't if, it was when and how, and it was terrible.
Well, using some sleep deprivation techniques or some stress positions, it's one thing, debatable whether or not it's torture, I suppose, but I mean, we start handing over detainees to the Egyptian intelligence service and these black sites that are completely unaccountable. The one in Poland that was completely illegal. You do start to run into these issues, as you mentioned, what's acceptable in a liberal democracy, and maybe a liberal democracy is able to accept, waterboarding a hardcore terrorist, but where does that line exist? If I, as an American, start pulling out a dude's fingernails, is that?
Well, but I think that is the line. I think that if somebody, after, a few days of sleep and some good meals and whatnot, if they walk out of that detention, or if they're the same person, not missing fingernails, not missing body parts, not
Are
having.
they the same person though, right? Like everything we know about PTSD today.
I remember I read this. I think it might be true, and it might be SAS selection, that there was a guy, a candidate, bound to a rail, train track, and hooded, and a double rail, right? Two sets of tracks, right?
Right.
And here goes a high-speed train down the other set, where he was not bound.
Oh,
But he can,
yeah.
but he can hear the train
He doesn't
coming.
know the difference.
You're going to hurt people mentally with that. It's like throwing someone out of a helicopter when it's hovering a foot or
Right.
two. So I think with our SEER training, regardless of how professional it is, you know at the end of the day there's a doctor there, and you can quit. On the waterboarding, or I think there was an Abu Ghraib photo where there may have been wires, 2 fingers.
Yeah.
And that was not enhanced interrogation, to be clear. That was just torture.
That was just Army people going to
I think the detainee didn't know that no one was ever going to plug that into
Right.
220. Okay. In fairness to CIA, it was always the minimum to get that piece of information. It was a foreign FI operation to collect intelligence. It was never punitive.
Right.
And that was
And
rather
there has
strict.
to be a lot of screening, I feel, that goes into programs like that. Like, you cannot hire the sadist. You can't hire the person who enjoys, like...
It's Dave, it's interesting you say this. I have a group of retired officers. We have a group chat. It's called Pork, and it's Rob and Joe, Mike, Don, Gail, Reg, and we talk about a lot of things. And of all that has happened with Ukraine and Russia, nothing bothered me more than Navalny killing a caged man. Is an extraordinarily cowardly thing to do. Even some of these, Litvinenko and the assassination in Berlin and the assassination that just happened in Spain, it took decent tradecraft, some cojones, to do this inside of a NATO country. The assassins in Madrid haven't been captured, but killing a caged man, what a coward.
So I mean,
Pardon me, I'm...
and we move on to the next thing, but I mean, the last question I feel like I have to ask you, because this is always the question, right? Did enhanced interrogation lead to actionable intelligence that prevented terrorist attacks on America?
Yes.
Are there any examples that you can cite where?
I can't, but I'm confident that, and now it has of course become political on one side of the aisle and the other, and that's unfortunate in this divided country of ours. To include the location of Bin Laden.
Yeah.
So I will push back on some who claim no, and that in fairness to CIA, it's a very it was a brilliant piece of work, and it was rather frustrating to people like me who were humaniters that we wanted to be a spy in his camp, and really was more on the interrogation, the analytical side. And kudos and great job.
So then you went on.
Fair enough? Is that?
No, I mean,
Yeah,
I
perfect.
understand that's as much as you're able to say. But then you went on and did some training with the training of the special operations community, kind of like in your wheelhouse. I mean, you talk about working with SWIC a little bit.
I really enjoyed it. I probably went Fort Bragg, Camp Liberty?
Fort Liberty now.
Fort Liberty.
Yeah, that's what we're supposed to call it now.
Should be Fort Cash, but that's okay.
Could be
And,
Fort many things.
Yeah,
but
Fort Benavides.
I spent one of my favorite speeches is Master Sergeant Benavides talk. That is a great motivating speech. That is really good.
Are you talking about the one that it's on YouTube where he talks about the guys? Yeah, I know.
They thought he was dead. They thought he was Vietnamese and dead, so but he wasn't dead. Oh, is he great? He wears his uniform, and yeah, it's just a great.
I remember the one you're talking about. Yeah.
And that in addition to teaching at SWCC, Special Warfare Center and School, I helped with Operational Design course, and that's really the TSOC show, and I was role played as Chief of Station, and Network Development course, and again role playing as Chief of Station, so that NCOs and to include junior NCOs and junior officers and a few warrants that they would, and PSYOP, Civil Affairs and 11 Bravos, SF, they would, the first time they met a COS would be in training and not in the field, and my job was to share some insider trading, tips of the trade, how to get a chief of station to say yes for your operational proposal. So I think it was good for the agency and good for the intelligence community, good for the country team, and good for our SOF brothers and sisters. And I did NSW as well and some MARSOC.
What was that like going from, I mean, you worked at a pretty strategic level doing strategic intelligence, and now this is where the rubber meets the asphalt, like a E5, E6 that's going to be doing like that sort of taxi cab driver human intelligence overseas.
The low level.
Because you know the E5 is going to win the insurgency or lose it. I'm sorry, General Petraeus.
Yeah.
Admiral McRaven.
It's a squad
General
leader's war.
McChrystal. I'm sorry. But they're going to, what's the name of the novel or the book in Vietnam, The Village, about Marine E4s and 5s, really
I
good.
don't know that.
Really good.
I don't think I do.
I'd love
I think
to
it's
read
called The Village. I think it's counterinsurgency.
Yeah.
Really good.
Well, and it's interesting because earlier before the show we talked about the difference between like DIA case officers and CIA case officers in like Iraq and the restrictions that the CIA case officers were under that the DIA weren't, and a lot of times, and I know a lot of like CIA case officers in Iraq were like bitter actually about being there, and they're like, this isn't our job, and they weren't necessarily wrong in the sense of it does take those
all this war stuff isn't what we were trained for.
It does take those, the E5, E6 out there, being able to run the low level, the tactical sources as opposed to the strategic sources.
Well, that was one of the revolutionary byproducts of a post-11 September world. That my career was Cold War, and then the wall came down, and then the towers came down. So I spanned both, and that and maybe why I wasn't necessarily myself a good fit for the GWAT, Global War on Hate and Terror, because of just how very, very tactical it was. And what I mean by that is I was trained and much more comfortable and rather good at producing an intelligence rule report that was 4 or 5 paragraphs long, and the plans, intentions, and activities of the Taliban during the upcoming rainy season. Pretty important. Or do you want a geocord so you can put a warhead on a forehead? No, seriously, and that's a really good debate right now. You want the geocord or the street address, such as a Baghdadi or a Abbottabad, Bin Laden, or do you want 4 or 5 paragraphs, plans, intentions, activities of Iran vis-a-vis the Taliban?
Right.
Plans, intentions, activities of Putin in 2024,
right.
2024 for Ukraine. Pretty, or the location of Wagner units in Mali. I mean, that I still subscribe to the 4 or 5 paragraph report.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, what's a geocord? What's the president going to do with that?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
What's Sec State? What's Sec Def going to do with that? How does that fit into the PDB?
Right.
The 4 or 5 paragraphs is really important. And I think we lost a little bit of that post 11 September because we needed a street asset, an email address, or a geocord. That's us. Imagine the FBI.
Yeah.
So you have since retired from the contracting work as well, and retired, living down in Florida. You want to talk about some of the volunteer work that you do down there?
Wait, so I, when I can, I help out the Cuban American community by way of the Bay of Pigs veterans. There's not many left, so I participate in those activities when I can. I also do some work with Wounded Warriors, the foundation, and then and other veteran organizations. And I run a small LLC, and I always try to, in fact, I only hire veterans who are transitioning.
That's fantastic.
Tell us about this startup company that you're with and what you guys do, because you've told me about it a few times, and it sounds like it's something that's like really needed nowadays.
So name of the company is 1.61. That's a golden ratio. A business partner who picked out the name, and it's cyber and urban safety, and it was really geared towards high-end, wealthy Latin Americans who were having issues at home, and they would come up to Miami, where we live, and we have a classroom, and the neighborhood. We would teach them Uber safety and subway safety and counter stalking and drink spiking and last resort self-defense and particularly cyber. But because there's some madness in this country, not as peaceful as some say, but not as violent as others say. Again, we're a divided country, but so some Americans, and so we think that you can do a whole lot to be safe without disrupting your daily life, and you don't really have to go the whole concealed carry route, which is a lifestyle change, and not just for executives, but teenagers, and very important, nannies. And the company was just certified by the state of Florida. Human trafficking is a big deal.
Yeah.
In Florida, the state mandates, and you will be inspected, that the front end of the hotel, all hotels in all of Florida, remember there's no state income tax because of the tourist industry, must be trained in human trafficking and red flags, front desk and cleaning crew. Not necessarily the chef, but
right.
But that's so we're certified to do that as well. So I think it might be a little bit different that a CIA guy doing something like this, but Jack and Dave, as you know from your time there, that Dave, that you have this collection mission, so you avoid the X, but if you get on the X, you get off the X, right? So we think about 90% of what we do is to avoid trouble in the first place, but if trouble finds you, we want you to get home. Not win, just get home.
Well, and you speak to the avoid trouble part, and it's interesting because, the example that comes to mind is Kim Kardashian, when she posted a photo in Paris. Yeah, she posted that photo of like out her hotel window, and then somebody, dismissed her security, and she got robbed. She got tied up and robbed, right?
Correct.
Holy shit, really?
Yeah.
So we
all because of a social media post, I think, right?
We've only been in operation 18 months, and we constantly have to upgrade our cyber because now we have artificial intelligence and voice cloning, especially from a teenager to a mom or dad.
Right.
Yeah.
They need money, and then you have, I understand, some cell phones are snatched here on the streets of New York. And the criminal, while the person's texting or talking, which isn't uncommon, and the criminal keeps tapping the screen to keep the phone open. And they get it to the safe house where the PayPal or the Zelle is emptied. So we work on that as well.
Yep. So never use Face ID to open your phone, and always use Face ID to open the apps on the phone. Like it's kind of, yeah.
Well,
that's correct.
Also, never ever post anything on social media about where you are.
Yeah.
You post about where you were.
Yeah.
Like after the vacation.
That's and Snapshot and Mr. Zuckerberg's apology to parents whose children committed suicide because of different things that's happening. So that's sexploitation. Very complicated because it really targets, frankly, families that have income of $150,000 or more, and
vulnerable
they
kids.
Zillow Trulia the house, and they know how much the house is worth, and they know if they go to the Dalton School on the Upper West Side what tuition is, and they know they can pay.
Right. Yeah. It's challenging. And the thing is the parent. I'm not a parent, but I imagine it's very hard to keep control over your children's communications, and the children aren't. They're just being kids. And if everybody else is posting their stuff on social media, they're going to post their stuff on social media, and that leaves them open to exploitation by very savvy operators a lot of times.
Correct. I do want to compliment the Team House, your show, and the interviewing that you do, and getting opinions, experiences on the record. What we wouldn't give for some of those case officers from Vietnam.
Oh yeah.
And those stations and bases, and how they handled penetrations of the Viet Cong. I would sit and watch every episode, even though I'm now retired. But what value they would have been to me in El Salvador or Southern Africa, and what tradecraft was used.
Yeah.
That is, and maybe some of them even learned Vietnamese, and so maybe some of this will be useful to
future generations. I hope so.
I that would be my dream. I mean, I feel as though after every conflict, or after every, we've, not just the military, but the intelligence community, like they purge, it's like we downsize or we get rid of these people, and then we have to rebuild. And it's, fortunately we're in a time now, because how amazing would it have been to talk to somebody in World War I, to hear their stories about trench warfare, or World War II, like to be able to interview those guys and to have that. And it's like, fortunately we're in a time now where, people like yourself, people with this incredible experience, who are gracious enough to come on and share that experience with us. We hope that it's, that we're documenting for future generations.
Great job.
Yeah, thank you. And it's all because of you. It's all because of you and the rest of our guests who come on and are willing to share your experiences.
Do we have questions for Dale?
Let me check. Dee, did you want to check Patreon?
We don't have any.
Nothing on Patreon?
Dale, while he's pulling that up, do you want to tell people where they can find your business if they want to hire you and your staff to come and give, classes and briefings?
Sure. So the easiest is through my LinkedIn, and reach out to me. You can direct message me. We also have a website, 161 ppp.com, personalprotectivetechniques.com. 161ppt.com is our website, and LinkedIn is very, very useful.
We've talked a couple times about what you guys do, and I've heard a little bit about your curriculum and what you guys go into, and I mean, it's the kind of stuff, like when I listen to it, it's like they should teach this to every kid in freaking elementary school. Should have this sort of information, like very basic. Because you do everything from like situational awareness, security on the streets,
Road rage,
to the cybersecurity, like just really basic things that every kid should do to protect themselves.
fentanyl.
Well, and it's
Roofies.
interesting because, like, when I was in high school, I don't know about you, Jack. Like, I don't know. I think high schools have changed, but like home ec was a course, right? Home economics, like where you learn how to do basic stuff around the house, like, and it's almost as if, I don't know if they still teach courses like that, but it's almost like courses like what you teach should be a part, just like basic finance should be a part of an education. a course like this, these days in modern times, should be a part of basic education for kids.
Unfortunately, yes, but it's you can't have a bad situation present itself and flip a switch and say, I wish I had had that.
Right.
How do I do CPR?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Do I restore the breathing first or stop the bleeding? Which one is it?
Yeah.
An active shooter and
Yeah, and this isn't like, living out in the mountains survivalist nonsense. This is like
This is
actual.
urban.
Yeah.
Well, it's
And
very
it's-
practical things
You're
for
not
everybody.
telling people to get off the grid. You're saying we don't
Yeah.
expect you to become a hermit and have no social media presence, but this is how you manage your life in these times.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Is that a
minimal disruption to your existing
right?
Yeah, yeah.
daily routine.
Right.
Otherwise, just stay home and throw your phone away.
Right.
No, nobody's going to do that, right?
Right.
We don't want Bin Ladens.
Right.
Find you anybody.
Unibombers.
But and you mentioned how like concealed carry is a lifestyle change, whereas just taking these basic measures, these preventive measures isn't necessary. But it's also interesting how the people who are very concerned with concealed carry and stuff like that, not all of them, but a small population of them are also very vociferous on social media. And it's like, you're not doing this right. Like, you have to protect yourself in all ways. You can't, like if you're taking this change to protect yourself with concealed carry, like stop blabbing about.
Oh, that you conceal carry all the time?
Yeah, stop
It kinda
blabbing about
defeats the
everything you
purpose.
do.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
EDC, is that?
Yeah, everyday carry, yeah.
So
Yeah.
spare magazine and, so.
And I support concealed carry. I'm not saying like don't do it. It's just that if you're doing it, but everybody knows you're doing it.
You don't really want to tell the bad guys that you're,
When a client comes to us and they want to learn to shoot, and we live in Florida, so we have the Everglades and we have very access to great facilities.
Yeah.
And we always say we're going to do 5 things on the range: safety, and then more safety.
Yeah.
Legal considerations, and then we'll learn to shoot.
Yeah.
Are you sure you want to do this?
The link to Dale's business is down in the description if you guys want to check it out.
Okay, real quick, the questions. M. Corbin, thank you very much. How can we bring the tried and true qualities of classical human intelligence sourcing into the cyber realm? If I have any luck with this, I'll never see a clearance. Would any alphabet boys even notice?
Very good question, and one of the reasons I fully retired is I felt that I was losing some relevancy, that I might know UAVs, but I really don't know drone swarms, and I'll get to the question in a second, but that's, as I understand, the Turkish drone that the Ukrainians were flying 2 years ago is now obsolete. And the First View drone, disposable $400 2 to 3 pound warhead is now proliferating. And
Right.
I haven't done it, so I can't really lead that.
Yeah.
And I greatly admire the current generation that can work that issue. And not far behind that is cyber. I'm pretty good at defensive cyber, but offensive cyber, I haven't done it, and so I don't feel I'm qualified to lead it. So it is blessing and a curse, digitization and human source, but it's not going anywhere. I mean, it's only going to continue because, particularly GWAT, we just can't, as a case officer working out of an embassy, you just can't meet some of these targets that we want to meet on the diplomatic circuit. So be very careful. I know there's been some issues with electronic communications, and maybe I should leave it at that. I'm just not qualified to comment on it. Only that it scares me.
I would like
for source protection.
Yeah, I would like you. I'm going to ask you for pure speculation right now, just an opinion, in terms of you've worked in foreign intelligence in a clandestine capacity. We've just talked about social media and things like this, things that the agency has never had to really deal with before. When we start talking about biometrics, how do you think, whether it's now or 10 years from now, how do you think technology is going to change the face of, covert activities, of clandestine services, things like that?
So I'm really not terribly qualified
Okay.
to expand on that very complex topic. I can just say that growing up in an agency where after you left the embassy or even the FOB downrange and you completed your operational act, and once you got back to the embassy or the FOB or home, it was over. Now, if I served in Europe 10 years ago, and I did have a cell phone, I'm sure that 8 March 2012, there's a record of where my cell phone was pinging. So it's always discoverable. And that's one of the reasons I probably was not very communicative on some of the topics.
Yeah.
That it's just can
Right.
can
Someone
walk-
could
can
start to
walk
figure
that.
out where
Right.
you were when.
Yeah, can walk that back.
I'm
I'm sorry to not get
No,
a
that's
terribly
okay.
sophisticated.
It's
I don't know if there's one out there either. by
No,
the way,
it's
so.
perfectly fine. I'm just curious because, you mentioned this idea, of like kids on social media, and, we talk about this, and kids are growing up now documenting their lives publicly, right? And we all do this, or most of us do, but most of us do it, I think, after our time in, service and whatnot, because social media wasn't really a thing prior to that. And things like PIMIs and the AI, like the AI capacity to
Well, this brings
collate
up,
this stuff.
That brings up the issue is that maybe the world isn't as messy as we think it is, because surely 100 years ago, 2 villages in eastern Congo, Zaire, Congo, one tribe pillaged another, and we would have never heard about it in 1924,
Right.
March of 1924, here in New York. But if it happens tomorrow, we're going to see YouTube.
Right.
So what I'm saying, the world has always been this complex, but just now that we
Have access
we know about
to
it.
Yeah.
So I was actually checking into booking a reservation for my hotel here, and we're teaching a course. We're down in Tribeca, and when I was talking to hotel management, they knew the name of my company because it was a corporate event, and they were Googling it and asking me questions from the website as I spoke to them. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
you have to be prepared for that, which
Yeah.
is
It's very interesting.
stunning.
Let's see your next question. Kim Z, thank you very much. What do you think about China investing in Mexico's surveillance technology and the new canal project to make Mexico a new hub of commerce?
Yeah. So I think that the intelligence community has it right, that our national security threats are China, 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 and then China, and then some Russia and some Iran. I mean, it is extraordinarily perplexing, and I'm not so sure we're good at it. That, let me ask you, we know all about the Chinese military attaché, 2PLA officer at the Chinese embassy in Quito or the Chinese consulate in Guayaquil. But who's more important, that individual or the Huawei rep?
Right.
So what do we do? I mean, how do we do that?
Right.
There's an insurgency in northern Mozambique. We send an A-team, and A-teams are very potent national security asset, really. But the Chinese send a 2-star who's an engineer, and they're going to build a port. What do we do?
Right.
And so that's and they do send. They do build a port and a bridge.
Right.
And we're looking for a 19-year-old shithead
Right.
with an S-vest.
Right.
ISIS West Africa or ISIS Central Africa. I forget. There's a name of the insurgency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, strange.
Well, even outside of like Africa, here in the United States, how do we deal with that Huawei rep, or how do we deal with Fang Fang, or how do we counter like the constant like penetration that it seems as though they're able to achieve here?
Correct.
And Danny, thank you very much. Does Mr. Bendler have any opinions on private military companies? Were they as prominent as they are now during his career?
So, actually, yes. And so I have some Southern Africa experience, and there was a executive outcome was a South African post-apartheid private military company, and they were quite effective in Angola, so they went on the payroll of their former enemy, and the white South Africans were quite efficient in the bush, that area. And I understand they also had a success in Sierra Leone.
Sierra Leone, yeah. We've had Eden
Eden
Barlow
Barlow,
on.
yeah.
He's
We
been
had
on
him on the show.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah.
Very interesting. And then I also think that in the case of I think in the case of Blackwater, remember, I think it's more of a private security company. It was really a defensive perimeter, important, and they did very good work for the U.S. government. But I don't think they were a private military company in that maneuver elements, moving in the direction of fire,
Right.
as did executive outcomes and
Right.
and Russia's
Yeah, yeah.
Russia's Wagner.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, no, I think Eric Prince always wished he could be Eben Barlow, but couldn't quite cut it.
Yeah.
Anything else for Dale?
I do think that they're despised until a country needs them. So, and they do bring, I do think, and it wasn't my idea, but maybe in Afghanistan, where I think you two served, that maybe we could have transitioned
To a model like that.
with some gray beards while we take out the 18, 19, 20-year-old 10th Mountain guys patrolling villages, and let's get some guys like you out there working with the locals and showing them some logistic and intel support, and maybe we could have given the Afghan forces a chance to shore themselves up.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
it's
I
easy.
get it.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, hindsight, it's not worth anything.
No, but it makes sense. I mean, especially, like talking to Scott Mann and others about like the village stability operations and how the U.S. government basically bailed on them. Like, well, what fills that vacuum?
Correct.
We got one more for Dale.
Kimsey, thank you. My agency caught some Russian nationals who are posing as ATT reps going into backyards to measure phone poles and telecom on equipment. Jack, help me with this millennial WYT? W-Y-T?
Say that again, D.
What do you think?
What do you think?
I guess.
The AT&T issue?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I mean, part of our training in my company is that when you don't have an iPhone, I mean, when it's a Katrina or it's an 11 September or it's your phone's stolen, or I mean, there was a world without iPhones, and it might happen. Correct me if I'm wrong. We had iron compasses when you went through the Q course. Then GPSs came in. Now iron compasses are back.
I mean, we always had compasses.
Yeah.
I don't think I mean, they always did land nav and SF.
Right.
That's never going away.
But
Yeah,
you had
yeah.
to, because GPS, it could fall in the hand of the enemy. It has locations on it.
can be
It can
spoofed.
be.
Yeah.
It can be spoofed.
Yeah. Yes. So an iron compass it's important. So.
Yeah.
You bet.
It's also tough, I think, to shoot a quick azimuth with with a GPS, like, pull out your compass. Yeah. M. Corbin said his original question. We talked about that though. How can we bring tried and true qualities, classical?
We talked about that one.
Sourcing into the set room. Yeah.
All right, so
and that's it.
Dale, I mean, any final thoughts or anything that you think I failed to cover here that you'd like to bring up?
Oh, sorry. Corbin's saying his first question. We only got one question.
We
from
asked it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wrote it in the chat. I asked them what was it because we didn't see it.
Final
Thank you.
thoughts?
All good. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity, and keep up the good work documenting these experiences. Hopefully I did a balance of some hard lessons learned and not necessarily the other way.
No, you did, and we deeply appreciate you sharing your
awesome.
experiences, your time with us.
We actually have one more question
Yeah.
from Joel. Have we put an over-reliance on technical means? As an extension of that, have we overshared between bureaus and agencies?
Have we?
Overshared between bureaus and agencies.
Well, the scar of
9/11.
911 is not, when I worked with my FBI partners, when it came to the CT issue, they have what we have, and hopefully we had what they had. I mean, we can't let that happen again.
Right.
And I've only had positive experiences post 11 September. I mean, it took the vaporization of 3,000 souls for us to cooperate, and we do.
Yeah.
So
Dale, thank you so much for coming in here and sharing your experiences with us. I mean, from El Salvador to Angola to Western Europe. I mean, this is like it is a piece of history. And it's always interesting to me because it's a living history. Like, you have to go and talk to the people, because as I found out, even with FOIA requests, sometimes the records don't even exist.
Oh.
Dale, we actually have one more comment. It's not really a question. It's from Drew Bendler. Great interview. Love you, Dad.
What was it?
From
Is that your son?
Drew Bendler. Great interview. Love you, Dad.
So I have, last point, 3 boys. The youngest is at an elite college, 6% acceptance rate, just to put it in perspective. Middle son just graduated from a good school just north of Chicago, D3 football player. And my oldest son is an E3 on active duty. So I love them all equally. I'm equally proud of them, but one of them is my hero. Can you guess which one? E3.
A guy that's an E3.
Yeah. He'll be deploying shortly. We're very proud of him. Like his grandfather, great-grandfather, grandfather, his father, and his uncle.
It's
All in the
wild.
family. My pleasure.
Well, we wish all 3 of them the best.
Yeah. Thank you for this, Dale.
Thank you.
And, you're welcome back anytime. And
thanks for making the trip up to see us.
Yeah,
to do
really.
Like, it's always great to talk to people like you with such a storied career. It's always more fun when you can sit here with us and
for sure.
Smoke
Smoke some
We're
cigars.
really here for the cigar and the scotch. So.
There you go.
You can come for a cigar and a scotch.
We're not afraid to bribe. New York Times knows us as the podcast that gets drunk and talks about. Yeah.
So next Friday, Jim Shorten's on the show, Mac v. SOG veteran. Excited to talk to him. We have coming up, I think next month, Jonah Mendez.
Wow, that's amazing.
Her book just came out this week. Got it in the mail. So actually,
That's for me,
Dave,
right?
that's for
Yeah.
you, man. So we'll be talking to her shortly as well. So thank you, Dale.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks
everybody.
everyone out there.
Thank you so much,
Thanks.
Dale. Really appreciate it.